Hello friends, we are Soul Fiction. Welcome to our channel. In today's video, we'll explore an exciting video on what if Naruto became omnipresent god due to the unknown mysterious Bijuu. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's dive into the story. Naruto may have only been 6 years old, but he'd spent his entire life in the temple. So he could tell something was up today. The priests and the acolytes were practically abuzz. He'd never seen them half so frantic as they were now. Nor was Naruto able to miss the number of looks he was given as they ran past. Unable to contain his curiosity, Naruto tugged at the robes of one of the younger acolytes, as the man was trying to scurry past. "Where's my father?" Naruto asked him when he came to a stop. "Shuhei-sama is very busy with preparations for the ritual," the white-robed man answered. "But he'll be sending for you shortly." "What ritual?" Naruto asked in confusion. "You mean no one has told you?" The acolyte replied in disbelief. "You've been chosen to be next conduit. Your father will summon the Bijuu later today." Naruto let out a gasp at that, not even stopping the man as he hurried off to continue his duties. He knew all about the Bijuu from his studies. The temple he lived at worshipped them after all. Currently, they were resting in their own realm as they had been for more than 5 decades. Naruto had known that they would soon be returning to the realm of men. To guide sinful mortals along the path of righteous if you listen to the long-winded old priests who lived in temple. Thankfully his own father wasn't nearly so bad, despite being the high priest. Still, Naruto had never imagined being the conduit himself. He may be the son of the high priest of this temple, but there were countless temples and shrines dedicated to the Bijuu around the world. Why had he been chosen? That was an answer he had still not received by the time he was led to the massive chamber that the entire temple was built around. The room had no ceiling, allowing for a view of the full moon directly overhead. There was strange glowing writing all along the walls, and in the center the priests stood around chanting in a language Naruto didn't understand. His father led him to the center of the circle, the taller blonde instructing him only to be brave and agree to whatever the Bijuu asked of him. Before Naruto was even sure of what was happening, his vision began to fill with a white light, and the sound of the chanting faded to silence. He soon felt as if he were floating, unable to move or hear anything, with only the endless light to keep him company. "Do you agree to become our conduit?" a voice asked almost in a whisper, yet somehow clearer than anything he'd ever heard. It seemed almost to be coming from inside his very head. Naruto tried to answer, but found he couldn't speak and almost started to panic. He tried shouting that he didn't understand what was going on, but he couldn't make any sound. "If you agree to become our conduit, your soul will be tied to ours," the voice explained, almost as if it could hear his doubts. "It will be the door we use to enter your world and the path to return to our own. When it comes time for us to rest again, your soul will return to our realm. Know that this means you will never pass on to heaven." He wouldn't go to heaven? Did that mean he'd be alone forever? Naruto was proud of being chosen as the conduit, but if that's what being chosen meant, he didn't want anything to do with it. "You will not be alone," the voice answered, convincing Naruto that it could indeed hear his thoughts. "When it is time to return, you may bring anyone who wishes to join you. Even if you bring no one, you will have the company of all the conduits who went before you and all they have brought with them." That was a huge relief to Naruto. The thought of never seeing anyone ever again had scared him more than he wanted to admit. But his father had told him to be brave, hadn't he? Naruto wanted to make his father proud. And he was sure his father would be willing to come with him when the time came. They could stay together and Naruto could meet all the other conduits. Maybe some of them would even be his friends. There were no other kids living in the temple, so Naruto had never really had a friend before. His mind made up, Naruto tried to tell the voice that he agreed. Almost before he'd finished the thought, he felt some sort of energy building in his body, almost as if he was on fire from the inside. Soon the white light vanished, and Naruto again found himself in the ritual room. It was impossible to miss the new additions, however, as the room now contained 9 massive forms belonging to the Bijuu. Largest of all was the Kyuubi, a 9-tailed fox that almost made the room the small. He could feel the energy radiating out from the Kyuubi's body. It was so powerful he thought it might sweep him away. Looking directly at him, Kyuubi spoke 3 simple words: "It is done." Becoming the conduit hadn't changed Naruto's life as much as he'd expected. Of course the new powers were beyond cool. He'd discovered that every scrape and bruise he'd get would heal in seconds. Even better, he'd learned he could call up that energy he'd felt during the ritual and it would give him super strength. He'd had a lot of fun carrying around rocks larger than he was above his head with one hand. The priests quickly put a stop to that, however, when he'd nearly given one of the old geezers a heart attack. There was also the fact that the Nibbies stayed around the temple most of the time these days. The rest of the Bijuu had spread across the world to do whatever it was they did. Mostly tell the leaders of the various countries what to do as far as he understood. Everything from what crops to plant and where, to what laws to pass. They also ensured that no wars took place between any of the nations. The priests were constantly telling Naruto how the world was a much better place when the Bijuu were here to rule than during the decades they rested in their own realm. Still, the novelty of Nibby and even his new powers soon wore off, and the last 2 years had been much like the rest of his life. His father made as much time as he could to play with Naruto, but the temple kept him very busy. That left Naruto lots of time and little to do but listen to lessons from the other priests, an activity Naruto avoided as best as he could. All of that changed one day when Naruto heard shouting coming from the main entrance to the temple. Naturally, he decided to investigate the source. It was a rare treat to have the priests worked up to the point they'd make a commotion this loud. Probably fighting over some minor religious point no one else would care about. What he found when he arrived was no simple argument, however. He rounded the corner just in time to see a tall man in a black cloak with red clouds on it open the back of a fleeing priest while a similarly dressed man looked on. "Naruto, run!" the wounded priest managed to call out before falling to the ground. "There's the brat," the unarmed intruder pointed out. "Kill him and the demons will have to return to their own realm." Even with the added threat from the two men, Naruto found himself rooted to the spot, unable to follow the priest's command to flee. He may very well have stood there in shock right up until they stuck a sword in him if he hadn't been grabbed roughly from behind and dragged away. Snapped out of his stupor, Naruto saw that it was his father who had lifted him into his arms and was now running away from the black-robed men as fast as he could. Unfortunately, when their pursuers rounded the corner, it became clear that they were faster than his father. "They're gaining on us," he shouted in warning, but his father running to give any reply. As they dashed down the hallway, the two men grew ever closer. They were hardly even slowed when one particularly brave acolyte tried to throw himself in their path. He was skewered on the larger man's sword for his effort while only seeming to buy them a second or two. It was becoming clear there was no way they could escape. But maybe they could fight them. If Naruto used the power the Bijuu had given them, he was sure he'd be stronger than them. "Put me down," he told his father, struggling to free himself from the man. "I can fight them." His father ignored his cries, instead sharply turning a corner and leaping down a flight of stairs. He hit the bottom harshly with a grunt, but continued running, despite the fact that he was now clearly in pain. They were quickly approaching one of the side exits to the temple. They made it out the door, but the larger of the men was now only a few feet behind them, within range of the man's sword. He was clearly aware of that fact, as he was already drawing it back to swing as he followed them out the door. Naruto made to call out a warning, but before he'd so much as opened his mouth, a large claw swept down and sliced cleanly through both men moments after they had left the temple. The Nibby stood there serenely looking down at him, the giant two-tailed cat seeming unfazed by what had just happened. His father finally set him down, kneeling on the ground and hugging him as worked to regain his breath. "Everything's going to be okay now, Naruto," he promised. "They can't hurt you anymore." Naruto's father had left the next day to find a way to ensure Naruto was better protected from future attacks. Meanwhile, Naruto was forced to spend almost all his time in the center room of the temple, protected by the Nibby. Thankfully, it remained both uneventful and dry until his father returned. Naruto was finally taken back inside the temple where his father escorted him into one temple's small studies and began to explain where he'd been. "There have always been those who were opposed to the Bijuu," he began. "Those who feel that mankind would be better off ruling itself. That said, I'd never imagined Akatsuki would have grown so bold as to attack one of our temples. Now, as powerful as the Bijuu are, I don't want them to be your only line of defense. In all honesty, they're better suited to dealing with armies than assassins." "So did you hire some guards or something?" Naruto asked. "I did better than that," his father answered. "I went to visit a clan of powerful warriors with unquestionable loyalty to the Bijuu. They're so devout that during the previous reign of the Bijuu they were given a blessing as reward for their service. The two of us will be living with them from now on, where the whole clan will be able to protect you. We're moving. Naruto cried out, caught completely off guard by that fact. Once he'd gotten past the initial shock, he was actually somewhat excited by the prospect, even if he was still a little scared. Naruto had always wanted to travel and see other places, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to leave the temple permanently. Yes, but don't worry, everyone from the temple will visit us as often as they can, he assured Naruto. They don't live too far from here. Although there is one more thing I should mention. His father looked hesitant to continue, which began to worry Naruto. He had come right out and told Naruto they were moving without so much as flinching. How shocking must this news be if he was worried about how to break it? Well, you see, I kind of made a deal, his father finally explained. In exchange for their protection I agreed that you would, marry a member of their clan. Marry? Naruto screeched barely coherently. He could count on one hand the number of women he remembered visiting the temple, pilgrims who rarely stayed more than a couple of days, and now he was getting married. Not anytime soon, of course, his father assured him. You're both far too young for that. It's just an engagement for now, so you'll have plenty of time to get to know her. His father's words did little to appease him. Naruto was not at all pleased with being forced into an engagement, a fact he made known very loudly for a good half-hour before he finally got the yelling out of his system. This being the first chance his father had to get a word in edgewise, he informed Naruto that his fiancée was actually in the temple, having traveled back with his father to meet Naruto. When his father was convinced he was calm enough to be polite, he went to fetch their guests. Soon a black-haired girl about his own age entered alongside a man who looked like he could have been her father. The most striking aspect about the two of them was that they both possessed almost completely white eyes. There was a circle that was a little darker in color than the outside, but other than that, they appeared featureless. As much as Naruto truly hated being forced into a marriage, seeing other children at the temple was even rarer than seeing women. While he wasn't looking for a wife, he didn't want to ruin the chance at making a friend. So he decided to put his best foot forward. I'm Naruto, he said, bowing as politely as he could. I'm Hyuga Hanabi, the girl answered in a reserved tone, bowing her head only slightly. Nice to meet you, Hyuga Hanabi, Naruto answered, smiling warmly, although she actually seemed upset by his greeting. Don't say it like that, she snapped, confusing Naruto. Are you trying to make fun of me? His father chuckled at exchange. Hyuga is Hanabi's clan name, he told Naruto before turning to address Hanabi. Forgive him, at the temple we give up all ties to our clan in service of the Bijuu. Naruto just isn't used to people with two names. That's stupid, Hanabi exclaimed. The clan is more important than anything. Why would you give it up? It's not stupid. Take that back, Naruto shouted angrily. Who did this girl think she was? Coming to their temple and making fun of how they did things. He wasn't about to stand for it. I said it's stupid because it's stupid. If you want me to take it back, then make me. If she was going to go so far as to ask him to, that Naruto was going to oblige her. Marching up to Hanabi, he reached out his arm to give her a shove. What he wasn't expecting was for her to grab his arm, twist around and flip him onto his back. While he was still stunned by her move, she twisted him onto his stomach and held his arm painfully behind his back. Naruto's anger was well beyond the boiling point by now, and he was already reaching for the power of the Bijuu. With the strength it gave him, he'd easily be able to break free from her and then he'd show her a thing or two. Naruto, no, his father ordered firmly, although not harshly, obviously sensing what Naruto had been intending to do. Your gift is not something to be used in petty squabbles, especially against your future wife. Let him up, Hanabi, the elder Hyuga ordered just as firmly. Hanabi released him, but appeared as reluctant to do so as Naruto was to stop drawing the power of the Bijuu. Nor did their father's words stop them from glaring at each other through the entire process. I'm never going to marry you, he vowed to Hanabi, keeping his voice low in hopes of avoiding a scolding from his father. Good, because I'm not going to marry you either, she replied. Naruto's life at the Hyuga clan compound wasn't nearly as bad as he'd feared. The only real downside was that Naruto and Hanabi remained at each other's throats as often as not. About the only thing they could ever agree on was that they were never going to marry each other. It became almost a mantra for them over the years, one they reminded each other of almost constantly. Still, as much as she drove him crazy with her arrogance and rudeness, Naruto had to secretly admit that he was glad she great having someone his own age to spend time with. They would explore the nooks and crannies of the complex, pretend to be famous heroes, and all sorts of other activities. And if nearly every one of their outings devolved into a brawl, well, that was almost the most enjoyable part of the whole experience. Being in the complex gave him plenty of practice with fighting too. He was trained in the Hyuga fighting style as much as anyone without the Byakugan could be. It turned out he had a natural talent for it. Despite the later start in life, in just a few short years, he'd caught up to Hanabi, who was considered quite talented herself. Well, if she fought without using her Byakugan, that is. But Naruto's father still forbid him from using his power in their fights, so Naruto thought it only fair she didn't use hers either. Not that his opinion stopped her when they were particularly upset with each other. As they grew older, Hanabi flowered from a girl to a very attractive young woman. It was almost a shame they couldn't stand each other. If she weren't impossible to live with, sometimes she'd almost be the perfect woman. She was smart, good-looking, a skilled fighter who could always keep him on his toes, and when she wasn't being infuriating, she was actually quite fun to be with. Then one day came when Naruto's father had practically thrown into a black kimono and dragged him outside to where he saw Hanabi dressed stunningly in a white wedding kimono. He hadn't heard so much as a peep of this being planned. Their fathers must have been craftier than he'd given them credit for. "We're not actually going to go through with this, are we?" he asked Hanabi, finding it somehow difficult to think clearly since he'd laid eyes on her. "Of course not," she replied with a playful smirk. "You know that I'll never marry you." "Ah, how silly of me," Naruto responded, smiling back. "We'll just play along for a bit and then run out from the ceremony. Just imagine the looks on our fathers' faces when we pull that off." With plan in mind, he entered the building the wedding was taking place in. Once inside, the two of them listened to Naruto's father perform the ceremony, said their vows, and drank the wedding sake. Only after the wedding was over did he realize that somewhere along the line it had slipped his mind that it was supposed to be an act while they got ready to run out of the ceremony. At that point, he couldn't have cared less that he'd forgotten. In the months that followed his wedding, Naruto was convinced that he was living in what would prove to be the happiest days of his life. He discovered he'd been wrong a little over a year later when Hanabi gave birth to their daughter, Hyuga Nanami. He loved every moment of being a father, although Hanabi became more than a little annoyed at how energetic and happy he seemed to matter how little sleep Nanami let them get. Another benefit of his link to the Bijuu. His marriage may have been saved by the fact that Nanami didn't stay a baby forever, and Hanabi was once again able to sleep undisturbed most nights. Nanami seemed to grow cuter as fast as she was growing larger. She took after her mother more than Naruto in looks, most noticeably with the Byakugan and the black hair. Although as far as hair was concerned she inherited the spikiness of Naruto's own to a smaller degree, a fact that would torment her as she approached her teens. Unsurprising, considering who her parents were, Nanami was highly skilled at Juken, a name the clan had recently given to the martial art they were still developing. While she was still in her teens she had surpassed many of the adult members of the clan. During this time, they also discovered that Naruto had stopped aging. Even into his 30s he didn't look to be a day over 20. Discussing the matter with the Nibi had confirmed that this was normal for conduits. Naruto wasn't complaining, even if visitors gave him strange looks when he told them Hanabi was his wife, or would no longer believe that Nanami was his daughter. It wasn't too long beyond that when a day arrived that Naruto had long been dreading. A wandering practitioner of martial arts by the name of Ichiro had heard of the skill of the Hyuga clan and come to issue a challenge. Nanami had accepted on behalf of the clan and promptly taken the poor fool apart, knocking him out and giving him a nasty concussion and some broken ribs. But somewhere between the fight and his recovery the two had fallen for each other, and now they were getting married. Naruto put on the happiest face he could manage for Nanami's sake, but inwardly he couldn't help but be depressed. And not just for the reasons every father hates to give away a daughter. It was more that the day he was dreading even more was drawing closer. The Bijuu didn't like to stay in the human realm for much more than 50 years, which gave him less than 2 decades. He'd already been devastated to learn that his father didn't plan to join him when he performed his duty as the conduit and followed the Bijuu to their realm. He'd argued for some time over it, but he could understand that his father wanted to be reunited with his wife, the mother that Naruto couldn't even remember. Now Naruto feared he would have to say goodbye to his daughter on that day as well. He had secretly harbored hopes that his daughter would never marry and would join him on his journey. Naruto supposed it was still possible she would. She might never have children of her own, or they could bring them along too. But would it be fair to take them before they'd even had a chance to live their lives? And even if she remained childless, it would mean forcing his daughter and son-in-law to choose whose parents to be separated from forever. And seeing as going with Naruto would mean giving up their lives, he had a feeling he knew which way the decision would go. No, it was best to prepare himself for the fact he would someday be leaving his daughter behind. If he didn't know Hanabi were going with him, the thought might have broken him, but as long as they were together, he felt they could work through anything. They would go on and find their own happiness in whatever life the realm of the Bijuu left them. And he still had more than a decade of life left to spend with his family. Maybe more than 2 if leaned on the Bijuu for some extra time. Long enough to have grandchildren and see them grow, perhaps. Yes, he shouldn't spoil what time remained worrying about the future. They had to wait less than a year for it to be apparent that their first grandchild was on the way. In fact, it was clear that the baby could come at any time the day a man showed up at the clan compound out of breath and demanding to see the Nibi. He told them he was from a nearby village, and the heavy rains had been causing the river to flood. They were doing everything they could to hold it back, but they were afraid it was a lost cause. He begged the Nibi to come help them before they lost all their homes and crops. The Nibi agreed to help, and Naruto volunteered to go along, an action that didn't seem to please the man. "I appreciate the offer," the man told him, "but we don't have any time to waste, and I'm sure Nibi-sama can travel much faster than yourself." "If that's all you're worried about, it won't be a problem," Naruto assured him, before quickly hopping up onto the back of the Nibi. "I won't slow her at all like this." The man couldn't help gawking at Naruto's actions, but made no further efforts to stop them. At the pace the Nibi set, it was less than 2 hours before they arrived at the village. However, when they did, they found that, while the river was much higher from the rain, it was not at risk of flooding. Nor did anyone know of a villager leaving to get help. Naruto had a bad feeling about the whole situation and urged the Nibi to return as quickly as possible. What he saw when he arrived was even worse. The man who had shown up at the village was now sporting one of the red clouded cloaks of Akatsuki and was holding a sword to his father's throat. Even worse, Hanabi, Nanami, and Ichiro were all sprawled on the ground with blood clearly visible on their clothing. He saw Nanami thrashing about, but Hanabi and Ichiro were frighteningly still. The fact that a number of Hyuga men were standing warily in a circle around the lone living Akatsuki member comforted him no more than the fact that there were more than twice as many bodies on the ground with Akatsuki cloaks than without. "You're the only one we wanted," the man exclaimed loudly when he saw Naruto. "If you just stayed here like I said, we might have avoided all this. If you wanted me, then you should have come for me, you coward," Naruto screamed as he jumped down from the Nibi, angrier than he'd ever been in his life. "We just wanted hostages," the man insisted. "They weren't supposed to resist. No one but you should have been harmed. Your wife, though, she killed 5 of my friends. I had to put her down. She didn't give me any choice. Give yourself up, though, and I'll let your father go. You might still save your daughter, too." "Nibi-sama, do it," his father yelled out, struggling against the man despite the blade at his throat. "No, don't," Naruto ordered when he realized what his father meant. But the Nibi was advancing regardless of his orders, carefully leaping about to avoid fallen bodies. "No. You wouldn't kill him," the man cried out in fear. "He's one of your priests." His words didn't slow the Nibi any more than Naruto's had, and as if in some twisted parody of his childhood memory, the Nibi's claw once again lashed out and sliced 2 men into pieces. Naruto's knees went weak at his father's death, but he quickly caught himself and joined the throng rushing in to see to the fallen. He was the first to Hanabi's side, but try as he might, could find no pulse or sign of breathing. Despite the shock of that discovery leaving him so numb he could barely think, he forced himself to move over to Nanami, where he found a Hyuga woman already looking her over. "This doesn't look good," she told Naruto. "Her wounds are beyond anything I know how to treat." Those words seemed to sever Naruto's tenuous connection to sanity as his mind seemed to fall away into his own pit of numbness and despair. If the Nibi's words hadn't come through like a lifeline at the last moment, he wasn't sure if he would have ever broken from his stupor. "Your wife's spirit yet lingers," the Nibi informed him. If we act quickly, I can begin process to return the Bijuu to our world and bring her with us. Naruto clung to the ray of hope the Nibi had just offered. Hanabi may be dead, but he could see her again in a few minutes. And Nanami was dying anyway, so he could take her with as well, right? What about Ichiro? He asked, for his daughter's sake. I'm sorry, but he's been dead for too long, the Nibi replied. Naruto was crushed to hear that, but still considered momentarily the possibility of taking Nanami as well. But no, Hanabi would never forgive him for separating Nanami and her husband without their consent. No more than she would look kindly on him abandoning their daughter and unborn grandchild without trying to save them, he realized. Can you do anything to save Nanami? He asked the Nibi. Perhaps one of the other Bijuu could, Nibi answered, but I know nothing of healing humans. That wasn't the answer Naruto wanted to hear, but he'd nearly lost himself to despair once. He wasn't going to give up now when his daughter needed him. Maybe if he projected the energy given to him by the Bijuu to her body, it would heal her like it did him. Judging from her wounds, it was clear she wouldn't survive via conventional means, and he couldn't think of any other options. With his decision made, he wasted no time drawing upon the energy as a white glow began to surround him. Placing his hands on Nanami, he tried to force it out through his hands and into her. At first nothing happened, but he kept trying and eventually he felt it begin to transfer to her. He heard a gasp from Nanami and released his power reflexively, afraid he was actually killing her after all. Berating himself, he started again and even began to force the transfer at a faster pace when he didn't notice any change. Soon, Nanami began to glow with a fainter version of the white light that formed an aura around Naruto. Then, to his great pleasure, he saw that cuts that Nanami had been bleeding from slowly close up until they eventually vanished. He continued to provide her with the healing energy until Nanami's eyes snapped open and she sat up with a start. "Father!" she cried out when she saw him. "Thank goodness you're back." As she looked around, he could see the memories of everything that happened rushing back to her by the way her emotions played across her face. "Ichiro, mother, they killed them," she cried out before latching onto him and sobbing into his chest. It was almost too much to bear that he would have to leave her now as well, right after the losses she just faced. But he couldn't afford to delay. He was spared from having to tell Nanami his plans when the Nibi interrupted. "It's too late," the Nibi exclaimed. "Her spirit has moved on." "No!" Naruto shouted in disbelief, trying briefly to free himself from his daughter, but giving up in the face of her iron grip. "It can't be too late. Isn't there a trail or something? Something you can use to find her?" "Her soul is now forever beyond the reach of my power," the Nibi answered, bowing her head as if in apology for her failure. "Then, they're really gone?" Nanami asked, looking every bit as miserable as Naruto felt. Still he had to be strong for her sake. "I'll make them pay," he promised her. "I swear to you that I'll hunt down and kill every last member of Akatsuki." "Good," Nanami replied, although she didn't slow her tears after that. In the face of everything that had happened, Naruto was no longer able to hold back his own emotions. So the two of them sat there crying over their shared losses and taking comfort in each other's presence. They were finally broken from their mourning when Nanami gave out a startled cry. "What is it?" Naruto asked, worried that his healing might not have been as effective as he'd thought. "The baby," she answered. "It's coming." Naruto was rooted to the spot just outside Nanami's house. It seemed like ages before the midwife finally opened the door. Seeing the dour look on her face immediately brought Naruto to the point of panic. "Nanami is fine," the woman told him, calming him down significantly. "What about the baby?" he queried, hoping that it was just oversight that the midwife hadn't mentioned that. "Your granddaughter is healthy," she answered, seeming to pick her words carefully. Naruto was certain something was up now, and practically pushed his way past the midwife. He was convinced the power he'd used to heal Nanami must have transformed her baby into some sort of hideous monster the way the midwife had been acting. When he entered, he saw Nanami resting with her daughter and his eyes immediately searched the baby for anything that might be wrong. But he couldn't find anything wrong with her. That was until he got a look at her eyes, perfectly normal-looking brown ones. He let out a huge sigh of relief at that. The lack of the Byakugan would be a huge deal to the Hyuga, but Naruto could hardly care less at the moment. Seeing Naruto, Nanami smiled at him. "Father, I'd like you to meet Harumi." The Hyuga had refused to let Naruto's father be buried on clan ground. Ichiro had married into the Hyuga clan much as Naruto had himself, but Naruto's father wasn't a Hyuga. It wasn't a huge inconvenience. Naruto and Nanami had spent a day traveling until they were well off clan ground and held their own funeral to see him off. No, the real problem was Harugan. Naruto had underestimated how much trouble that would cause. Some of the Hyuga were convinced that they'd let their blood grow too thin and they needed to implement policies to keep it pure. Others had an even worse opinion. There were those who thought that Harumi's eyes were a sign she was cursed by the Bijuu. They quickly learned not to say that within Naruto's hearing. The worst part was, the Nibi couldn't even do much to dispel that rumor. She said that the Byakugan was a gift of the Hachibi, and that for all she knew, it could have been his will that Harumi be denied it. Still, Naruto was convinced he could just ignore the talk, but even that proved too much to hope when, less than a year after Harumi's birth, his daughter pulled him aside. She informed him that the clan leadership had decided that Harumi would be denied entry into the clan registry. Worse, she was to be expelled from the village. "You can't be serious," Naruto protested when he heard the news. "We won't let them do that." "It's the right decision, father," Nanami responded. "At best she'd grow up an outsider in the village. At worst, she truly is cursed. And harboring her could cause our clan to lose the favor of the Bijuu." "You can't possibly believe that nonsense about the curse." Naruto sputtered out in disbelief that the clan would have gotten to Nanami with that talk. "I believe it's possible," she admitted. "Ichiro was never particularly reverent of the Bijuu. This could be my punishment for marrying him anyway." "You were at least planning on going with her, right?" Naruto asked hopefully, but her lack of reply was all the answer he needed, causing his scowl to deepen. "It's not as if I'm happy about doing this," she finally said. "Nevertheless, my place is here, and the clan will make sure she has a good family. She'll be happier this way." "I'll take care of her," Naruto stated in a tone that brooked no argument. "She won't be allowed in the village no matter who raises her," Nanami insisted. "Then I'll leave the village," Naruto snapped back. "After all, I don't have your precious Byakugan either." "Father, be reasonable," she said soothingly. "It's different for you, you're the conduit. Besides, it's our job to protect you." "Feel free to continue to protect me," Naruto said. "You'll find me by Harumi's side." In the end, Naruto had chosen the site of his father's grave and set to work building a home. His daughter had consented to keep Harumi until he'd finished constructing it. Secretly, he'd hoped this extra time would serve to change her mind, but sadly such was not the case. Naruto moved into the home, which he was embarrassed to say was rather poorly built. Still, the surrounding area had plenty of trees, and Naruto soon set to work on a replacement in his free time. All in all, he repeated the process of building a new house and then tearing down the old one a dozen times over the course of the next 2 years. Finally, all that practice paid off and he had a home he was proud of. This was much to the disappointment of Harumi, who loved nothing more than to watch him tear apart one of their old houses until it collapsed. As far as raising Harumi went, Naruto doted on her more than he had his own daughter. He wanted to do his best to make up for the girl growing up without either of her parents, her only companions being her grandfather and the Nibi. If it weren't for the eyes, Harumi would still have looked every bit the Hyuga. 2 generations had erased most of the Naruto's own features from the girl. The only real mark left was that her otherwise straight black hair had one large spike in the back left that refused to stay down. Raising her was such a joy that Naruto was almost willing to forget his vow of vengeance, yet whenever he considered it, he just remembered Hanabi's body lying there in a pool of blood and his flames of anger were stoked back to their previous fury. So with his goal still in mind, he continued to train whenever he could. This wasn't as easy as he'd like. He had a couple of friends among the Hyuga who would occasionally risk the clan's wrath to come out and spar with him. To his eternal dismay, Nanami wasn't one of them. Harumi had formed a rather large rift between father and daughter. Even 10 years after her birth, Nanami refused to so much as come visit her. In response, Naruto stubbornly refused to ever stop by the Hyuga village, much less return permanently as Nanami kept demanding. As such, they only ever communicated through letters, despite being less than a day's travel from each other. And even those letters grew less frequent and more bitter over the years. Naruto didn't limit his training to himself, either. He did his best to ensure Harumi could defend herself. Nor did he ever leave the girl alone, always fearing Akatsuki might again go after those he cared about. But for whatever reason, they never did. For their part, the Bijuu began to make it clear they wished to return to their own realm in the near future. Also that they opposed his plan for vengeance, as it would put his life at risk. Naruto tried to convince them to help wipe out Akatsuki if they were so worried, but they insisted that they would not act as the aggressor against human. If Naruto decided to pick a fight with Akatsuki, they were forbidden to get involved even to protect his life. If Naruto insisted on going through with it, he would be on his own. Their warnings never swayed him, however, and it was shortly after Harumi's 20th birthday that Naruto finally decided he could delay his vengeance no longer. Breaking that news to Harumi was probably the hardest thing he'd ever done. She'd begged him to stay. She'd begged to go with him. She'd begged him to simply perform the ritual as the Bijuu requested and take her as well. When Naruto turned down each request, she tried one final tactic. Instead of spending your time getting vengeance for grandmother, wouldn't it be better to find some way to be with her again? Harumi asked him. I would give anything if I could, Naruto answered, but my soul is tied to the Bijuu. Then convince them to untie it, Harumi insisted, and if they refuse, find a way to break free yourself. I'll help you do it. Together I'm sure we can find a way. Naruto couldn't believe he'd never considered the possibility himself. He supposed that's what you got from having it ingrained in you since you were 6 years old that the end result was inevitable. He didn't know if it was even possible to do, but it was certainly worth looking into. Naruto even considered taking Harumi up on her offer and staying. No, he finally said after much deliberation. I swore an oath while standing over your grandmother's body. I won't break my word. I will swear a new one to you, though. As soon as I'm finished dealing with Akatsuki, the first thing I'll do is come back here to find you. Then we'll find a way to free me from the Bijuu, just like you said. I'll only ask you one more time, but please, stay here for my sake, she begged him. For a moment Naruto thought her eyes flashed red, but that must have just been a trick of the light caused by her tears. I'm sorry, was all he answered before engulfing her in a hug and giving his final farewell. Despite his vow to return, he had to convince the Nibi to physically restrain Harumi before he was able to escape. Even then, it took all his will not to turn around and run back. Instead, he kept moving forward. Finding his first member of Akatsuki turned out to be easier than he'd expected. He'd simply been asking around in a nearby town. The man had approached him, having heard about the person asking after him. He was dressed in a full suit of black armor with the red clouds painted on it. The stylized armor and sword made it clear the man was a samurai. The samurai were supposed to be unparalleled warriors, but Naruto didn't despair. How many of them had more than half a century of being physically in their prime? Not to mention the power of the Bijuu he could call upon to aid himself. The two wasted little time with chatter, both clearly eager to kill the other. Unfortunately for Naruto, the fight didn't go as well as he'd hoped. If anything, the samurai was even a little faster than he was. And with the added range of his sword, and the skill with which he wielded it, Naruto was unable to get close enough to actually hit him. Meanwhile, he'd taken countless cuts, especially upon his arms when he did try to attack. All of them quickly healed themselves, but for the first time since he'd become the conduit, he could actually feel himself growing weary. He wasn't sure his healing would last much longer, and he doubted he could live through a decapitation if one of the frequent attacks aimed for his neck got through. Realizing he would have to change tactics, his mind raced until he came up with a plan. Continuing to dodge, he carefully watched his opponent, waiting for him to make the move Naruto needed. Finally he made a thrust at Naruto's neck, which Naruto quickly danced to the left of. But rather than leaving it at that, he brought his right arm up and slammed the forearm into the point of the blade, skewering it. With the strength his power gave him, he was easily able to twist his arm to the side and wrench the sword from his opponent. Then, not giving him a moment to recover, he dashed in and slammed his fist into his opponent's helmet, following through and slamming him into the ground. The metal of the helmet caved in from the force of his blow, and a quick check confirmed the samurai had not survived the attack. Finally removing the sword from his arm, he saw the wound healing much slower than usual, as if struggling to do so. Finally it did close, leaving Naruto feeling as if he could barely stand. He sat down in the middle of the road to think, none of those who hadn't fled the fight looking particularly eager to object. He was beginning to have doubts about his ability to follow through on his plan. That fight had been a much closer thing than he cared to admit. Nor did it seem likely his strongest opponent would be the first he faced. Not to mention they might not be so kind as to fight him one at a time. No, he wasn't about to give up, but he would need to prepare. Since the samurai were such powerful warriors, he would learn from them himself. And if he was going to learn their ways, he may as well learn from the best. With his mind made up, Naruto set off for the Land of Iron. It turned out to be slightly more complicated than simply showing up at their door and asking for training. The guard had openly laughed at him, saying that samurai began their education as young children and he was much too old to start. When Naruto proceeded to give the armed and armored guard a beating with his bare fists, they brought someone a little more willing to listen. Even so, gaining admittance had required Naruto to reveal that he was the conduit to Guro, a samurai who looked to be pushing 50 and currently was in charge of the school. After convincing him, Guro had made him swear not to reveal that fact to anyone else. It seemed that even among the samurai of the Land of Iron there were those who did not look upon the Bijuu in a friendly light. Naruto was very pleased with progress he made in his training once it began. The samurai had techniques to use the body's own chakra to grant increased speed. It was something his previous training had caused him to do subconsciously, but with more direct control, the results were significantly improved. Even better, with some practice he did on his own, he was able to find a way to use the power of the Bijuu in a similar manner, so his speed increased as well as his strength. Within the first year he'd progressed to the point where the samurai he'd killed wouldn't have been a threat to him at all. Still, his time spent training with Guro showed that there were potentially far more dangerous opponents out there, so he continued his studies. His progress with swordplay wasn't quite as smooth. Despite how his body looked, he was over 60 years old. Juken had been central to his fighting style for most of that time, and he found it near impossible to give that up and start from scratch. He finally began to make progress when he gave up learning the style of the Land of Iron and began to develop his own style of swordplay based on Juken. It wasn't an easy task, considering Juken was made for unarmed combat, but he pressed on, and Goro's help he was able to make great strides. At the end of 10 years, even Guro was impressed with what they'd come up with. It was now an effective sword fighting style, but anyone who was trained in Juken would clearly be able to see many of the same tactics and flows of movement that they were familiar with. Naruto had never planned to stay for a full 10 years, but Guro always seemed to talk him into staying just a little longer to make sure he was ready. Finally, he'd had enough though and could be delayed no longer. He told Guro that while he wanted all of Akatsuki dead, he didn't want it to be of old age. Besides, even with old trainees departing and new ones coming in, it was commonly discussed how Naruto didn't seem to be getting any older. Guro consented, and Naruto wished the old samurai a fond farewell before setting off to finally get his long-awaited revenge. Naruto quickly set into a routine of traveling around, asking after members of Akatsuki, then hunting them down and killing them when he found a lead. Thanks to his 10 years of training, none of his opponents proved particularly dangerous. The most annoying part of the journey was that the Kyuubi apparently had some sort of telepathic link to him, and hounded him endlessly to return to perform the ritual. Naruto had broached the subject of releasing himself from his position as the conduit, but the Kyuubi refused completely. All he would say was that Naruto had agreed to take the position and they intended to hold him to it. After 10 years of this, however, it became clear to Naruto that Akatsuki was replacing their numbers as fast as he could kill them. These days, not only did they have those who never wanted to live under the Bijuu to recruit from, but those angry that the Bijuu had abandoned them as well. It was only after Naruto had finished training in the Land of Iron that he'd learned the Bijuu had left their posts and ceased any interference with the humans only a few years after he'd left home. They could still be found in whatever area the Bijuu had made their home, proving they'd yet to return to their own realm, but they refused any pleas for aid or advice. When asked, Kyuubi told him it was because they were weary from their time in the realm of mortals. Naruto, however, secretly wondered if this was just a ploy to get him to perform the ritual. Whatever the reason, it was making it nearly impossible for Naruto to complete the eradication of his sworn enemies. Naruto decided to take a different approach from that point on. He redoubled his efforts to hunt down Akatsuki and did his best to advertise his efforts. He wanted it known throughout the world that donning that accursed cloak was as good as a death sentence. His efforts began to bear fruit, and within 10 years it was becoming very hard for him to find anyone who would admit to any affiliation with the group. People didn't even want to talk about Akatsuki anymore for fear of the blonde demon killing all who opposed the will of the Bijuu. Naruto found that quite funny considering he was in direct opposition to the will of the Bijuu himself, as Kyuubi constantly reminded him. Naruto was beginning to think his decades-long quest was nearly at an end. Most of the leads he'd been getting lately turned out to be nothing but a dead end, and the one he was currently following seemed likely to be another. Someone claimed to have heard rumors of M meeting in a nearby cave. When Naruto arrived there, he didn't see any sign of light inside. Wishing he'd had the foresight to bring a torch, he improvised by summoning the power of the Bijuu to create a glow around him. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, and he wanted to get this wild goose chase over with. He traveled through the cave for some time until it opened into a large cavern. His senses told him something was wrong even before torches began to light up all around him. Once his eyes adjusted to the sudden light, he saw that there were more than 100 members of Akatsuki surrounding him. "I see you came," one of the figures called out smugly. "Our days of sitting idly while you hunt us down are over. You see before you every last remaining member of our organization. One way or another, it all ends today." "Perfect," Naruto replied, doing his best to sound more confident than he felt. "You couldn't have given me a better gift." "You may change your mind shortly," he shot back. "Ever since you started your attempt to exterminate us, we've been hiding our strongest members, training them hard specifically to kill you. This isn't just 100 members of Akatsuki, this is 100 of the strongest members Akatsuki has ever had." Naruto didn't know if the boast were true or simply meant to intimidate him, but either way he couldn't afford to let them make the first move. He needed to get his back to a wall, so he picked a target near a promising section and charged him. His opponents reacted quickly to his charge. While he succeeding in stabbing his target through the chest with his sword, and scattering the rest enough to give him so space, he paid for his gains. He'd taken a spear in the side, a throwing knife of some sort in the back, and had several deep cuts from sword swipes that were already healing. He pulled out the spear and the knife to let those wounds heal as well, but it seemed the boast regarding their skill wasn't empty. Naruto couldn't afford to make an exchange like that for every kill he got. Nor were they giving him any time to think up a plan as the throng was already charging toward him. Summoning more of the power of the Bijuu than he'd ever called on before, his aura flared out in an impressive display that caused most of his opponents to halt their charge and eye him warily. One large man who was particularly brave continued unerringly in his assault. In response, Naruto shot his aura out toward the man, who finally stopped in his tracks as he attempted to dodge. His efforts came too late as the white light enveloped him. His companions looked on with morbid curiosity to see what would happen, but their friend seemed perfectly fine as Naruto's aura retreated. Indeed, the man calmly stood up and dusted himself off. "Was that supposed to hurt?" he mocked Naruto. "If anything, I feel refreshed, like I just woke up from a good night's sleep." Naruto cursed that his act of desperation was so futile. He shouldn't have attacked with it. If they were still afraid of the light, he could have thinned their numbers before they got their act together again. He just hoped it would prove an effective weapon. "You must really be desperate if you're trying something as pathetic as that," the same man who had first spoken called out. "Although before you die, I would like to know what we did that could have made you pursue us so doggedly." "You killed my wife," Naruto spat out in reply. "Surely that can't be all," he responded, clearly trying to anger Naruto. "You know I actually met your wife, don't you? I visited your little village of demon worshippers to spy on you prior to our operation. I even got to chat a bit with Hanabi." Naruto started a bit that he actually knew her name. Was this not just a lie made up to goad him into acting carelessly? "She was a pretty enough woman for her age, I'll grant you that," he continued. "But she was hardly very feminine at all. Honestly, I found her quite dull. I can see how it might be a minor inconvenience to lose her, but surely there was something else that provoked you." Although Naruto was probably playing right into his hands, the man's words succeeded in enraging him. They were also sealing his own death as Naruto vowed that venom-spewing mouth would breathe its last breath tonight no matter what happened. "I was going to tell you we'd be sending you to her shortly," he sneered, "but then I remembered, you'll be joining your demon masters in hell, won't you?" Making light of Naruto's eternal separation from Hanabi after playing a part in killing her. If Naruto thought he was angry before, it paled before the fury that nearly pushed all rational thought to the side. He could feel his anger seeping out of him, and the white aura around him turned blood red, as if corrupted by his rage. It almost felt as if it was setting his skin on fire. "You think you can scare us now just by changing the color?" the large man he'd previously hit with his aura asked with a laugh. "We've already seen how harmless your little light show is." Finishing his speech, he charged at Naruto again. Almost by instinct, Naruto lashed out again with his aura, and this time his opponent didn't even try to dodge. Only in contrast to the previous attack, the large Akatsuki member was certainly not refreshed. A better description of what happened would be burned alive. While his foes were still standing there stunned by what had happened, Naruto sent out a second wave of the red aura at the group's unofficial spokesperson. It lashed out faster than the man could react, and Naruto pressed so much power into the attack, that when he finally let up, nothing remained of his tormentor but a pile of ashes. The room erupted into chaos at this point. Some charged Naruto in an attempt to cut him down. Others tried to flee. There were even some who threw down their weapons in surrender and begged his forgiveness. Naruto burned them all, not allowing a single survivor. What had looked to be the hardest fight of his life turned into a complete massacre. When it was finally over, Naruto collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. He was even more exhausted after his final fight with Akatsuki than he'd been after his first. Lying there with the fruits of his labor, Naruto felt somewhat cheated. Shouldn't there be some great sense of vindication? Some sort of weight off his back? He'd finally fulfilled his oath he swore half a century ago. Yet he couldn't find the least bit of pride in that. He felt as empty as he ever had. Even though his strength had quickly recovered, Naruto continued to lie on the cave floor throughout the night, reflecting on what he'd done. He was surrounded by charred flesh, melted armor, skeletons, some of which were half burned to ashes themselves. He began to wonder how many of them had anything to do with Hanabi's death. How many had truly deserved to die? There had even been a few women among them. How many wives did he kill? How many husbands and sons and brothers perished in his quest for vengeance? He may have sat there for days if he hadn't remembered another oath he'd made. He'd promised Harumi he'd return as soon as he had dealt with Akatsuki. Remembering that vow brought a sudden epiphany. Chasing down Akatsuki had brought him no joy, but back before he'd left, the time he'd spent with his granddaughter, he'd actually been quite happy much of the time. Promise or not, he was a fool for having ever left. But one thing was certain, after 30 years away, Naruto was going home. Arriving at the home he'd raised Harumi in, Naruto's heart fell to see the place was abandoned. From the looks of it, it had been many years since anyone had lived there. Of course, Naruto shouldn't have been surprised about that. He could hardly expect her to live as a hermit all these years. She'd probably just moved to one of the nearby villages, likely the one Naruto had often taken her to as a child. Thirlatina Nanami would know where she was. The bitterness from the decades-long rift between them made him balk at the thought of asking her, but Naruto quickly stamped down on that. He'd already let anger ruin much of his life. He wasn't going to let pride finish its work. He'd make the first move to reconciliation and go see his daughter. Resting one more night in the worn-down old home he knew so well, he made an early start and pushed hard toward the village, arriving before noon. There, a young Hyuga not much past 20 made to stop Naruto. "Halt! What business do you have here?" the man demanded of him, getting into a familiar battle stance. "Not much for hospitality these days, are you?" Naruto noted dryly. "These days are very dangerous times," the guard snapped back. "Now state your name and your business. If you're here to hire us, I'm going to need to see your funds before I let you in. You don't look like the type that can afford us." Naruto was curious as to what that was about hiring them, but he didn't want to stand here all day dealing with the guard, so he cut right to the chase. "I'm Hyuga Naruto, and I'm here to see my daughter." "Hyuga, ha," the man scoffed. "Do you take me for an idiot? You're not a... Wait, Hyuga Naruto?" His eyes went wide as he seemed to finally recognize the name. The man looked him over, and Naruto could see the wheels turning as he matched him to whatever description he'd heard growing up. The end result was a very pale and much more respectful guard. "Forgive me, sir," he said. "I didn't recognize you. Follow me and I'll take you to Nanami-sama. I should warn you, she's been somewhat ill lately." That didn't worry Naruto as much as it should have. Probably because he was just glad to hear she was still alive. She was over 70 now, and it was well within the realm of possibility that she would have already passed on. The age became clear when he was led into the room. He even hesitated upon seeing the woman lying in her futon. The wrinkled, white-haired, frail-looking form was so different from the barely 22, strong young woman he still pictured from the last time he saw his daughter 50 years ago. If her face hadn't lit up the moment she spotted him, he might have gone on wondering if it was really her. "Father," she called out happily. I thought I'd never see you again." In that moment, it didn't matter what Nanami looked like, or how many nasty things they'd said to each other over the years. Naruto was instantly kneeling at her side, looking down at where she lay. "I came," he said comfortingly. "I should have been here long ago, but I came." "You were right," Nanami told him. "I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but you were right. I should have kept Harumi no matter what the clan said. I know it's no excuse, but after what happened to Mother and Ichiro, there was just something broken inside me." "It's all right," Naruto told her, doing his best to comfort her, seeing how distraught she clearly was. "I abandoned Harumi too, and for worse reasons than you. At least you did it for the sake of your clan, instead of something as petty as vengeance." "Given that as was for the sake of this clan, I have to disagree with you," Nanami replied tersely. "The clan was rotten before and it's only gotten worse. Despite my protests, they've turned into a bunch of common mercenaries, doing anything for a bit of gold." "I heard something to that effect at the entrance," Naruto agreed. "Also, I'll admit I don't think much of the clan myself." "I have a favor to ask of you," Nanami said, suddenly growing somber again as she changed the subject. "If you ever see Harumi, tell her that I'm sorry, and that despite all the unforgivable things I did, I always loved her." "Of course I will," Naruto promised, "but does that mean you don't know where she is?" "She vanished less than a week after you did," she answered. "I wish I could help you, but I haven't heard anything of her since." "Don't worry, I'll do my best to find her," Naruto assured her, "and I believe I can do something to help you. I hear you've been ill." "Is that how they put it?" Nanami huffed out. "What they mean is that I'm dying, and they can't wait for me to hurry up and get it done with." "You seem to catch dying a lot," Naruto quipped. "But I cured you the first time, and I don't see why this time should be any different." However, summoning his aura around him, it wasn't the familiar white aura, but the red one he'd used in his recent battle. He certainly wasn't going to use that on Nanami, but why was it even red in the first place? He wasn't angry this time. He tried to will it to turn white, but it didn't have any effect. "Is something wrong?" Nanami asked, seeing his frown. "Just a little problem," Naruto answered. "Don't worry though, I'll figure it out." Figuring it out proved to be more difficult than he'd anticipated, and Nanami was growing worse as the days passed. Naruto worked continuously on a solution, to the point that Nanami eventually begged him to stop. She insisted that if she were fated to die, they had to accept that, and she didn't want to waste what time they had left. Naruto finally consented on the surface, although that didn't stop him from working on it whenever Nanami slept, using the power of the Bijuu to stave off his own need for rest. Even so, Nanami's condition worsened without any sign of progress on Naruto's part, and less than a month later, she passed away. Naruto mourned deeply for his loss, but soon set out to serve her memory by fulfilling her dying wish. He started his search for Harumi in the surrounding villages, and expanded it further when he had no luck there. Searching for some clue of Harumi became an obsession of Naruto's that led him all across the continent. His quest continued fruitlessly for 60 years before he finally had to face the facts that he was never going to see her again. He could only hope that she'd been happy in whatever life she made for herself. Now, if he followed through on her idea to free himself from the Bijuu, he might even see her, Nanami, and Hanabi again in the afterlife. To have that happen, he was willing to put in as much work as necessary, no matter how long it took. Given that he was a century and a half old but still looked 20, he figured time was something he had no shortage of. Naruto concluded that the best place to start his research would be the temples of the world. There was no better place to learn of spiritual matters such as souls. It was amusing how as a child he avoided lessons on the topic whenever possible, and now he planned to devote his life to such studies. Thankfully, in the very first temple he visited, he learned enough chakra control to block out the Kyuubi so he'd only hear him if he wished to. That was a huge relief to his sanity. As good as he'd gotten at ignoring Kyuubi's complaints, he found it so refreshing to not have to hear them at all. His progress on other matters were much less profitable. He learned from his very first temple that there was some kind of energy tied so deeply with his soul that they almost became one. Yet neither that temple, nor the 10 after that had any idea how to separate them, or if such a thing was even possible. Still, he learned everything he could concerning spiritual powers from each temple before moving on, hoping that some of it might prove useful. Some temples with masters of the art he would stay at for a decade or more. Others with no skilled practitioners he might remain in only a week until he was convinced they had nothing new to offer him. Over time, it grew harder and harder to find a temple that had anything he hadn't already learned. At that point, it became clear he would have to blaze his own trail. Naruto still did most of his work in various temples around the world. Another person to bounce ideas off of, give a fresh perspective, or help work on theory was too valuable an asset even if they Wahan he was. He would even take years out of his time to train a promising student so that they could better grasp what he was trying to do. This worked well for some time, but despite seeming to be no closer to a solution than when he'd started, Naruto had greatly advanced the field of spiritual studies. As such, it was taking more and more time to teach the priests and monks he worked with even the foundation necessary to have a basic understanding of the advanced concepts he was researching. This was especially problematic, as virtually everyone with significant training to begin with was already well on in years. It wouldn't exactly do much good to train someone for a decade or two only to have them retire or worse. He considered finding some young disciples to train from youth so they would have their whole life to catch up to Naruto's level and eventually help him. It was an interesting notion, but Naruto was pretty sure he would make more progress on his own than by raising a bunch of pupils in hopes they would help him later in life. One thing Naruto did do was write down everything he'd learned on matters of chakra and its uses into one large book. He carried it around to a number of temples, letting them make copies. His hopes was that with it as a guide, the students of those temples would be much more skilled should he visit them again decades later. Perhaps they'd even do their own research and take it in a different direction than Naruto. They might expand on certain parts and have things to teach him when he returned. All in all, by the time Naruto finished distributing his book and set off to continue his quest on his own, he had spent over 200 years traveling to and from the world's temples. Not that his research into chakra and the human soul were the only things he did during that time. He picked up a number of other skills along the way. Cooking was one such example. Naruto had become a fairly competent cook from raising Harumi on his own. Traveling the world by himself had given him lots of opportunity to practice, and since a good meal was a great way to keep one's spirits up on a long road, Naruto made it a habit to pick up what recipes he could wherever he went. Naruto both could and had prepared a different dish for every meal for an entire year. He'd also had chance to improve his skills in carpentry and add masonry to the list. Many temples were a bit on the rundown side, and Naruto was always happy to help with repairs, or even a few new construction projects. It was a simple physical task he could do while his mind still worked on other problems. Sometimes a bit of physical activity was just what he needed to get his creative juices flowing. One other skill he'd been almost forced to pick up was swordsmithing. The roads were commonly filled with brigands who took him for an easy target. Even a well-made sword didn't last forever, especially when Naruto got a bit too energetic with his fights. After the first time he needed to replace his sword, he realized that they weren't cheap. Sadly, wandering around the world and studying at temples wasn't a great source of income. So he'd found some time to learn to make his own, as the raw materials were much cheaper. Although the savings turned out not to be needed for long, on his travels, Naruto soon learned that with the roads being as dangerous as they were, people were willing to pay considerably more for a good produced in a faraway city than that city charged to buy it. Soon Naruto was doing a bit of a trading wherever he went and was astonished by how much coin he was able to make in that manner. Not that it stopped him from continuing his swordsmithing. It was another simple activity he could do while thinking over a problem, and he took pride as the ever higher quality swords he crafted. Naruto eventually even came up with a way to imbue them with chakra to make them much stronger and more durable. Taking his spiritual studies, and all the other skills he'd learned, Naruto decided to withdraw from society completely for a time to work on a lesser problem that he believed he might finally be able to solve. Namely, the corruption of the power the Bijuu had given him. He wanted to solve this not just because it would be nice to be able to heal others with it again, but because it had impeded his studies as well. Even calling on the power was painful to him, and dangerous for anyone else to probe with their chakra. Being able to examine the power in use could go a long way toward figuring out how to sever it from his soul. Unfortunately, the more deeply one probed, the more agonizing the pain, and he'd never been able to get as clear a look as he wanted at the heart of that mass. During his years of travel, Naruto had successfully learned to purify the parts of his chakra that were corrupted. The issue was that the corruption would spread back to the areas he'd already purified from those he hadn't gotten to yet. When Naruto had set himself up a little abode in a cave by a waterfall, he tried several different approaches to overcome that issue. Purifying faster than the red chakra could spread itself again proved all but hopeless. Trying to charge up one big blast of purification looked more promising at first, but always missed thousands of tiny pockets of red chakra that would grow to many times their original size before Naruto could even track them down. The method that showed the most promising involved a technique Naruto had discovered to split his chakra in two in such a way that they wouldn't mingle. He could then purify it one tiny piece at a time and quickly move it to the pure half before it could be corrupted. This wasn't as easy as it sounded, as there was much that could go wrong. If he failed to completely purify the section he was going to move, it would pollute everything he'd already purified. If he was a little too slow to move it, it would already have been tainted before it was removed. If he overcompensated for that, had pulled it over too forcefully, he would bring along some of the chakra that had never been purified in the first place. If he lost his concentration for even a moment, the barrier separating the two halves would break down. If he failed in any of these areas, he would lose all the progress he'd made. As if all of that weren't enough, his connection to the Bijuu gave him a lot of their special chakra. At the rate he was able to purify it, it would take him more than a month of constant work to clean it all. Not even to mention that he had to do it all while his body felt like it was on fire. The level of frustration this caused was almost beyond describing. Early on he'd mess up hundreds of times in a single day, but as he got more skilled, he would frequently lose a whole week of work as fatigue set in and made him careless, which was even more demoralizing in his opinion. He'd even had one attempt where he choked just minutes from completion. When all was said and done, Naruto's efforts paid off and the Bijuu's chakra was as pure white as it had ever been. The price he had paid to do so was over 100 years of solitude, as best as Naruto could figure. He'd lost track of the exact number of years somewhere along the way. One thing that was certain was that he was going to be very careful to never let his rage pollute that chakra again. Now, however, he could finally get back to the reason he'd started this journey to begin with. Naruto spent the next few years making the greatest strides into his understanding of the Bijuu ever. He didn't yet have any ideas for a solution, but for the first time in a long time it actually felt like he would eventually find one. Even no longer needing solitude, he might have stayed in that cave for many years to come if his training had been interrupted by a howl of rage from the Kyuubi that smashed through all the barriers he'd put up to prevent being bothered by the leader of the Bijuu. Not appreciating, tried to query Kyuubi as to what had possessed him to do that. When he got no answer, he became more than a little annoyed and continued to send ever-increasing numbers of questions Kyuubi's way. Still receiving nothing but silence in answer, he gathered his power and gave his own blast across the line to pay him back for the one that had caught Naruto by surprise. That caused a reaction as he heard a yelp through the connection. That was followed by a quick thanks with no explanation for why before he went silent again. Trying to question him further made it clear that Kyuubi was now blocking Naruto's attempts to chat, much as Naruto had been doing for centuries. Giving up on that route, Naruto decided to make a more direct investigation. With all the power flowing through their link, Naruto had been able to sense more or less where the Kyuubi had been. When he completed the journey, what he found was a large valley with a waterfall that looked to have taken some major damage recently. That was almost certainly the Kyuubi's work, but he could find no signs of where the Bijuu had gone or what had precipitated this rampage. Deciding to search the surrounding countryside, Naruto was surprised to find a nearby village that seemed to be run by ninja. Back before he'd become a hermit, ninja were already popping up like weeds, but he'd never imagined them getting together and forming their own community. And looking at this Konoha, it was a decent-sized village too. They were currently celebrating a major victory of their leader had over some guy named Uchiha Madara, but Naruto cared little about that. There was no mention of the Kyuubi, and Naruto soon gave up on finding any leads there. Leaving, he continued searching around the area before smoke drew him to a second, much smaller village. At first he thought he might have found the lead he needed, but it only took a glance at the devastated town to realize this had been the work of men. He'd seen situations like this before and knew what would have happened. A group of armed men had come in, killed all the villagers, looted it for valuables, then, just because they could, set everything left on fire. To his surprise, Naruto's finely tuned senses detected that someone was still alive in there. Hurrying to the source, he heard crying coming from under the rubble of a collapsed building that was still partially burning. Permeating the rubble with his chakra, he got an image in his mind of exactly how it was distributed. Then, taking out his sword, he cut a path to the source of the crying, doing his best to avoid removing anything that was holding up the rest of the mess. He still barely had time to grab the small girl that had been buried and pull her free before the whole thing collapsed in on itself again. Looking over the sobbing little brown-haired girl who couldn't have been more than 5, he saw that she was in terrible shape. Her legs had been crushed under whatever had pinned her, she had some nasty burns, and she was still coughing from the smoke between sobs. Still, it was a miracle she was alive at all. She had managed to hide from the robbers and survive a burning building falling on top of her. To add to her luck, she was found by possibly the only person in the world able to heal her. Some kami must be watching out for the little girl. Summoning his white chakra, and still relishing how pure it felt, he forced it into the small frame he held. The burns quickly faded away, and the coughing stopped soon after. The legs took a while longer, but eventually there wasn't so much as bruise to show they had been crushed just minutes ago. The sobbing slowed to sniffles as Naruto finished healing the girl. "You'll be all right now, little girl," he said soothing. "What's your name?" The girl just looked at him wordlessly. "What does your mother call you?" he asked, trying again to get a name from her, but she just started sobbing again instead. Naruto cursed himself for a fool. He was standing here in the middle of this carnage interrogating the poor girl and bringing up a mother that was probably one of the corpses spread around the village. Cradling the child, he ran off, heading out into the woods and away from the scene. However, even when he had set up camp well away from the scene of destruction, the girl still refused to say a word. He wondered if she might be mute, but considering she wouldn't so much as nod her head yes or no in answer to questions, it was more likely a result of her recent trauma. Having raised 2 girls himself, Naruto had more than a bit of a soft spot for them, and felt compelled to try to help, even though he wasn't sure what to do. In the end he just decided to talk to her. He knew she wouldn't answer any questions, so instead he told her stories. He recited a few fairy tales at first, but somehow he got into talking a bit about his own life and just ran with it from there. Nothing profound like his life goal or his family, he wanted to keep the stories as light and cheerful as possible. So he talked about adventures he had been on, places he'd seen, funny stories he could remember. She would listen intently to all of them. She also ate whenever he served her food, meals which Naruto did his best to ensure were top-notch. Yet she stubbornly remained silent. However, if she were trying to outlast him, she picked the wrong person. Naruto had lived a very long life and had no shortage of tales to tell. Finally, after a week-long story time, the girl spoke up. "Ko-chan," she said simply. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Naruto replied, not sure what to make of her words, but thrilled she'd spoken them. "My mother called me Ko-chan," she clarified. "Well then Ko-chan, I know you just went through something terrible, but how about would you like it if I found someone nice to take care of you?" "I want to stay with you," Ko-chan replied stubbornly. "I'm afraid my life isn't a good one for raising children," he said in attempt to dissuade her. "Besides, I abandoned the last little girl I brought up, probably best not to get too attached. I'll find you a real family, a great one. You'll be much happier that way." The girl didn't look convinced, but neither did she argue. He just hoped she wouldn't lapse back into silence over this. Naruto took the girl back to Konoha, that seeming as good a place as any to look for someone to take her in. Finding Ko-chan a family was slightly problematic at first. It seemed a village of ninja had its fair share of orphans already. Naruto was a determined person, however, and had quite a few resources at his disposal. They may not use any of the coins he had on him anymore, but gold was still valuable. Once he'd greased a few palms, Ko-chan was soon being shown around to some nice potential families. From there, one was quickly found that would take her, although that was mostly due to the girl's innate sweetness and charm. Despite them being more than financially capable of taking care of her on their own, Naruto left them a little something to thank them for efforts. Their eyes had nearly bugged out on just how much that little something was. Then, so he wouldn't feel too guilty about basically cutting the line for Ko-chan, he gave a slightly larger donation to the orphanage, to help take care of those children. Finally, he prepared to say his goodbyes. Before he could go, Ko-chan insisted they needed to get a picture together. This seemed a reasonable request, so Naruto said he'd go find a painter, a statement that elicited a laugh from the child. "No, with a camera, silly," she said. Naruto didn't recognize what a camera picture was, but not wanting to admit that, simply said that it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Asking around the town had confirmed that to be the case, and he was soon standing with Ko-chan in front of a man with a rather strange contraption. It was a large box over a foot on each side that was resting on 3 metal legs. The man using this camera ducked his head under a curtain behind the box and held up a strange T-shaped rod of some sort. "Hold still and smile," the man told them. As confused as he still was, Naruto did as he was told and was soon treated to a bright flash of light from the rod, which then started to smoke a bit. He wouldn't have thought that was supposed to happen, but neither the man nor Ko-chan seemed at all surprised. Naruto had to wait until the next day for the picture to develop, but he was quite interested in the result. The picture was limited in color to white and different shades of gray, but other than that seemed to capture the scene more accurately than any painting he'd ever seen. They even had 2 copies of which Naruto couldn't find the slightest variation between them. Mystery still unsolved, he nonetheless took one for himself, while Ko-chan kept the other. Then he said his goodbyes and went on his way. Having put aside his quest to find the Kyuubi, Naruto decided to make another tour of the world's temples. He could see if his book had borne any fruit. What he found in temple after temple was an almost disgusting level of incompetence. The only temple that had been at all worth his time was run by a priest who had once trained to be a ninja. He had this amusing little technique called a bunshin that would create an insubstantial copy of the user. Naruto learned it quickly, and his mind was already going through some possibilities. Perhaps there would be some way to create a copy of himself and trick Ritual into taking it instead of him. It was certainly worth looking into. With that in mind, Naruto began experimenting with modifying and improving the bunshin ability as he traveled around. The temples may have been mostly a waste of time, but the cities and villages proved to be quite educational. It was shocking how much civilization had changed while he'd been out of the loop. Cameras were only the start of it, what with electricity and light bulbs and all manner of strange machines. It was also continuing to change at what seemed lightning speed to Naruto as they were constantly coming up with new innovations over the 60 years he'd traveled. He'd made much progress with his bunshin as well. Naruto had improved the technique to use the elements to make a copy that would fool a doctor and leave a corpse when it died. And using his extensive knowledge of chakra, he could make it indistinguishable from him to anyone's spiritual senses as well. At least if they didn't probe deep enough to where they'd find Naruto's connection to the Bijuu, which he could not copy in any clones. Nor did it change the fact that it was still a soulless creation. The soul was the important part too. No matter how similar the body, it could never replace him in the ritual even if he did find some way to finish it before he was yanked through as well by the chain on his soul. He could leave behind a body with all his memories and personality, but without his soul it still couldn't move on to any afterlife, and the original Naruto would be stuck with the Bijuu. No, it had been an interesting thought, but it was almost certainly just another dead end. His tour around the world was eventually cut short when he finally felt a tinge of the Kyuubi again. He'd been watching his connection closely for the last 60 years, and that had finally paid off. Naruto had no idea where the Kyuubi had been, but he figured it might be related to the first incident. As such, he should start his search there. The plan was a sound one, as before he'd even completely arrived, he sensed the Kyuubi much stronger than before and not too far from valley he'd found near Konoha. Redoubling his efforts, he soon found the Kyuubi, rampaging wildly. There were several dead bodies around the Bijuu that looked to be ninja from the nearby Konoha. Naruto tried calling out to Kyuubi, starting through his link and after that physically, but the first had no effect and the second only made him the enraged Bijuu's new target. Dodging a swing from a claw, Naruto's mind was racing furiously, trying to come up with a way to dispel whatever madness had possessed the Kyuubi before more lives were lost, particularly his own. He tried blasting energy through their link, but that proved futile. Dodging another claw swipe, Naruto decided maybe a more direct application of his energy was in order. Summoning up as much of his white chakra as he could, Naruto focused a huge portion of it around his fist, until it was blazing almost as brightly as the sun. Charging the Kyuubi, he dodged a tail lash, and another attempt to shred him with a claw before jumping into the air and socking the Kyuubi to the jaw with his charged fist. The blow wouldn't really have added anything to the process, and Naruto could have just as easily projected his aura at the Kyuubi, but he had simply felt an irresistible urge to punch the stupid fox. He was hopeful his plan had worked, as the fox shook his head and the fury seemed to fade out of him. "Naruto, it seems you've freed me again," Kyuubi said, physically speaking to him for the first time since he was 6. I assume you're referring to what happened 60 years ago, Naruto replied, but what's this about freeing you? We have been in your realm far longer than we ever should have stayed, Kyuubi informed him. The time has left us weaker and put great strain upon us. It drove the Ichibi mad to the point that the humans had to seal him away. Even I have been left vulnerable to manipulation. I'd like to meet the person who was brave enough to manipulate you, Naruto quipped, although in truth he was quite impressed with the feat. You would do well to stay away from Uchiha Madara, Kyuubi warned him. I will attempt to do so as well. However, he has already found me twice, and I suspect he will a third time. The world will surely suffer when he does. That is, unless you perform your role as the conduit, as is your duty. If this is so terrible for all of you, why don't you just release me as I've asked all along? Naruto inquired. Find someone else to be your conduit and this can all be over. It is not that I will not release you, Kyuubi answered. Even I cannot break the bonds that tie us while we yet remain in the realm of man. I don't believe you, Naruto shouted at him. All these years you've been saying you wouldn't. If you couldn't, that why not come right out and say so before now? You were mourning the loss of your wife, Kyuubi explained. I have been led to believe humans act irrationally under such circumstances. I was concerned if you knew there was no hope you might simply kill yourself out of spite. And you don't think hundreds of years is a bit long to wait to tell me? Naruto snapped back. How long do you think humans remain irrational? I may have erred, the Kyuubi admitted. It is difficult for me to think of spans of time in the same way as you mortals. Naruto was beginning to believe the Kyuubi's words. He supposed it really didn't change much. He'd been living on the assumption that the Bijuu wouldn't release him, just because they didn't change the fact that he'd have to find a way himself. That didn't mean the Kyuubi's explanation hadn't left him bitter. You seem awfully worried about me killing myself, Naruto pointed out. What would happen if I did so now? We would still return to our world, and you with us, he answered. However, if we return improperly in that manner, we would lose the thread that binds our world together. We would never be able to find it again to return. Yeah, and where would you be without a bunch of humans to boss around, huh? Naruto jeered. There are more ninja on the way, Kyuubi informed him, not being provoked by his words. I suggest you depart, as they may not take kindly to your presence here. The Kyuubi took his own advice and raced off. Naruto attempted to follow him, but couldn't keep up with the Bijuu, weakened or not. At least those ninja that were heading his way. Minato didn't know what to make of this situation. He'd received reports of the Kyuubi rampaging toward the village. Yet the beast had simply killed their front line of defense and then fled for reasons unknown. Recall all ninja ranked Chunin or higher, he ordered to the ninja that accompanied him. Stay on high alert. Triple the number of scouts we have in the field and have them searching out twice as far as usual. He hoped the Kyuubi truly was gone, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He had a feeling they'd be seeing it again someday. He just prayed that day wasn't anytime soon. Given that one of them had managed to perform some sort of mind control the Kyuubi himself, Naruto was beginning to think that it might be worth investigating these ninja to see what techniques they had. If nothing else, he might want to look up the Madara guy, despite Kyuubi's warnings. Perhaps he could influence the Bijuu to force them to help him find a way to break their link. Still, before he did that, he wanted to look into the other Bijuu. Kyuubi's news about the Ichibi going mad had him a bit worried. In a way, any death caused by the Bijuu could be laying at his feet and Naruto's conscience wouldn't let him ignore that threat. So, he started another journey around the world, this time trying to find the Bijuu. Locating them proved slightly troublesome. As their whereabouts tended to be rather closely guarded secrets, he wasn't able to exactly locate them all. However, in less than 5 years, he was able to at least confirm that all of them, save the Kyuubi, had been safely sealed. So it was finally time to look into what tricks the ninja had, and what better place to start than in Konoha. If there was one thing Naruto had learned about ninja when he was searching out the location of the Bijuu, it was that they tended to be a very secretive and suspicious lot. This was particularly true of anything that could be useful as a weapon. So he hardly expected to be able to walk in and ask politely for them to teach him everything they knew. Instead, Naruto decided he'd just sneak in during the night and borrow whatever he needed. Now the question was, where to look? That large tower seemed as good a place to start as any. Spotting a man in black robes with a strange white mask prowling the rooftops, Naruto politely asked to use his costume. So he had already knocked the man out first. His request was still the very height of etiquette and the man spoke no objections. Donning his newfound robes, Naruto made his way for the tower. Ninja may have a reputation for stealth, but Naruto was confident that not one of them could mask their chakra half as well as he could. They liked to simply suppress their chakra to the best of their abilities. But even if they were completely successful, one could still detect that if they knew what to look for. Even the air had tiny traces of chakra in it, especially in an area full of so many people constantly giving it off. A complete lack of chakra could be sensed with enough training. The true way to hide oneself is to have your chakra mimic the flows of the air itself, a highly complicated technique that, as far as he knew, he was the only person to ever master. Sneaking into the tower proved simple. Finding anything of value was much more challenging. He wandered around for quite some time, avoiding patrols as he went, but they didn't seem to leave writings on their techniques just lying around in the hallways. Naruto continued to work his way up the tower, searching it floor by floor when he felt a small surge of chakra from right where his foot had just stepped. It was probably designed so that the person who triggered wouldn't even notice, but to Naruto's developed senses, it may as well have been a bonfire. Naruto had to appreciate the effective simplicity of the trap. No matter how good he got at remaining unnoticed, he still had to walk to get anywhere. So a simple little seal that detected pressure on the floor above it could undo all the work he'd put into stealth. Naruto knew he had to get out of there quickly, as it would have warned whoever had left the trap of his presence. Still, he'd expected a little more than 2 seconds before he sensed someone behind him. "What are you doing in this part of the tower?" a voice demanded to know from behind him. Spinning around, Naruto saw a man in red and white robes glaring at him suspiciously. Yet it wasn't his robes that caught Naruto's attention. To his great shock, the man's face looked exactly like his father's had. Now Naruto had been around the world a few times, and he'd seen a number of people who looked very similar despite being unrelated. Not to mention that it had been over 500 years since Naruto had last seen his father looking so young. No matter how important a person was in one's life, the details of how they looked faded over time. In fact, if just that morning Naruto had been asked to draw his father's face, it probably wouldn't have looked much like the man in front of him at all. So logically, Naruto should just write it off as a superficial resemblance that caused his mind to draw a stronger connection that truly existed. Still, deep down he couldn't bring himself to believe that. Something about that face just resonated with his memory and told him that this was exactly what his father had looked like. This entire thought process had taken only a few seconds as Naruto's mind was racing at top speed. Even so, either the delay in a response was too long, or perhaps some of Naruto's surprise had somehow been noticeable despite the robe and mask. Whatever the reason, his father's doppelganger attacked, hurling a strange pronged dagger at his head. Naruto leaned to the side to let it pass. His gaze was instinctively drawn to an unfamiliar seal attached to the hilt of the weapon, despite knowing that you shouldn't take your eyes off your opponent when you fight. His curiosity probably saved him a nasty stab wound, however, when his attacker appeared in front of his eyes right next to the dagger, grabbed hold of it again, and attempted to carve open his chest. Naruto was certain this hadn't been a simple burst of speed. Thanks to his curiosity, Naruto had a perfect view of the man's reappearance, and there was no actual movement involved. Judging by the chakra radiated by the seal on the dagger right before the feet, the chakra-imbued writing was somehow involved. That would explain its presence on the weapon. Naruto narrowly avoided the attack that followed the teleportation technique and continued to struggle with dodging subsequent attempts to shred him to pieces. It was clear that his adversary was significantly faster than he was. This fight was making Naruto wish he'd done more to keep his body in shape. Although as fast as the other blonde was moving, he might have been a match for Naruto even in his prime. Back when he was a young man of 90 on a mad quest for vengeance. If he used his white chakra, things would be much different. But given the relationship between man and Bijuu these days, just sensing that power could cause a panic in Konoha, something he had no desire to do. Besides, Naruto could heal most any wound if it came to that, so he could afford to take some risks. Not to mention that, while his body was out of shape and sluggish, his chakra abilities were better than they'd ever been. Now to start pulling from his bag of tricks to find a way to get out of here. For his first ploy he actually shifted his entire chakra aura 1 foot to the right, hoping this would cause some confusion. It worked even better than he'd anticipated, as the man seemed to be trained to trust his senses over his own eyes and was focusing his attacks on the projection. Using the distraction, Naruto was able to avoid the assault and leap out a nearby window, landing on the roof of another building below. His pursuer followed the truth of Naruto's technique in adjusting his attacks. Even so, now he had to think about them slightly rather than simply relying on instinct. For fights on this level, the tiny moment of hesitation that caused made a noticeable difference, and Naruto found it less of a struggle to keep his hide intact. He still had a disadvantage in speed, but staying alive wasn't quite as difficult as winning a fight. Seeing as his opponent relied so heavily on his chakra sense, Naruto decided to play with his a bit more. Tearing a tile off the roof he was standing on, he imbued it with a bit of chakra and flung it at his target. The blonde easily dodged it, but as soon as it had passed behind him, Naruto made the chakra in the tile flare to many times its previous strength. The technique itself was harmless, but as Naruto had hoped, the ninja didn't know that. Sensing the buildup of power, he turned to defend himself from whatever it signified. Naruto used the distraction to dash in and slip a punch through his guard, sending him crashing to the street below and creating a small crater. Then, hurrying to make his escape before he had a chance to recover, Naruto jumped down onto the road on the opposite side of the building. Then, he projected his chakra aura further out while simultaneously masking his actual body as well as he could. Finishing that process in a moment, he quickly jumped up and clung to the overhanging roof, hiding himself from the sight of anyone who wasn't standing beneath him. Meanwhile, he was sending his projection further out, as if continuing to run away down the alley. Once his projection turned another corner, he winked it out of existence. His plan again proved successful as he sensed that his assailant running off in the direction his projection had been headed before it disappeared. Slipping down from his hiding spot, Naruto ran off in the opposite direction. He easily made it to the wall and away from the village without seeing any sign of pursuit. Reflecting on his recent ordeal, it had been far more exciting than he'd anticipated. Of course, seeing that teleportation trick had only made Naruto all the more determined to pump these ninja for whatever they had. Not to mention the mystery around his father's lookalike. "So, what was that ruckus all about last night?" Sarutobi asked Minato after strolling into his office. "We had a spy break into the Hokage Tower," he answered. "He stole an Anbu uniform from one of our guards on duty and started snooping around." "Who was the victim?" Sarutobi asked, his face turning grim. Surprisingly enough, the man was merely unconscious, Minato informed him. The only thing injured was his pride. "Well, we can be thankful for that," the former Hokage declared, cheering up a big. "Our enemies aren't usually so kind. Sadly, that makes our allies the prime suspects. They most likely wanted to reduce the political fallout if he was captured. Do we know what he was after?" "No," Minato answered. "Our analysis shows it was unlikely he got whatever he was looking for before he set off a detection seal. I'm more worried that he might come back." "Oh, was he that dangerous?" Sarutobi inquired. "I confronted him myself and he managed to escape unharmed," Minato admitted, which left his predecessor suitably impressed. He seemed to be some sort of genjutsu specialist, although his taijutsu wasn't bad either. "Whatever he was doing, it was very subtle, such as throwing my chakra senses off so it felt like something was in a slightly different location or had much more chakra in it than it really did." "That's very odd," Sarutobi muttered in reply. "Usually genjutsu focuses on the other 5 senses. It certainly can manipulate your 6th sense, but since that's so much harder, why affect that but not the others as well? It only makes it obvious you're under genjutsu." "It made for a clever trick though," Minato explained. "For those very reasons I assumed it was my sight that was wrong. Also, I was having trouble breaking free. I'm not a genjutsu expert myself, but it's possible it's harder to free yourself under such conditions." "I can see how that would work," Sarutobi agreed. "Clever fellow whoever he is." "That's not the worst part either," Minato told him. "He had a sword strapped to his side but never used it. He might be even more deadly with kenjutsu. His priority was obviously fleeing, most likely lacking confidence that he could take the yellow flash. If he'd run into someone else though, we'd have to hope he'd avoid killing even when his own life was on the line," Sarutobi finished for him, not even bothering to mention exactly how likely they both knew that was. nor can we be sure he was a spy instead of an assassin. You understand my dilemma then, Minato said morosely. He may not give up on his mission so quickly when we weren't even able to identify him. Fine, I'll help watch the tower when you can't be there, Sarutobi offered. I know that's what you're after. Thank you, Minato told him graciously, glad he didn't have to come out and ask him. Minato knew the elderly man was trying to enjoy his retirement, but he felt it was important. He just couldn't shake the feeling that they'd be seeing more of their mystery man. Rather than immediately make another attempt at the tower, Naruto set his sights a little lower. He'd search other parts of the village, hopefully with less security, while things settled down from his first break-in. He might be able to gather a little intel first. It didn't take much eavesdropping around the village to discover that there were a number of clans living within the walls, each with their own special techniques. Supposedly they kept these guarded in their compounds built throughout Konoha. Deciding to start there, Naruto began to raid those locations. He had much better luck with security, not even being detected as far as he knew, but his results weren't what he hoped. Some of the buildings he couldn't find anything of use in. Others, he found scrolls that looked promising, but as they were in some sort of code, they could have been a recipe for soup as far as he knew. He'd only come away with 2 real scrolls, and both were very basic stuff. Not that he wasn't pleased to have them, as they covered the general theory behind hand seals and genjutsu, both being new fields of study to him. Nevertheless, his original plan was looking less and less promising. He supposed it only made sense that they wouldn't leave their most closely guarded secrets lying around on scrolls that just anyone could pick up and read. And if the clans had such security, what were the odds of finding anything useful in the Hokage Tower? At least he did know that's what it was now. And the man who looked like his father had been the Yondaime, Namikaze Minato. Naruto decided to continue his raids for the moment while he thought up a new plan, but the second compound he visited temporarily pushed all thoughts of new techniques out of his mind. For right before his eyes were proof that the Hyuga clan had settled in Konoha. Technically, having married into the clan or not, Naruto had little love for the Hyuga. As such, he had never been particularly interested in searching them out, even after all his years away from them. Still, having them right here in front of his eyes, he couldn't help but be a bit curious. Naruto knew those eyes of theirs would make this a particularly dangerous complex to sneak into undetected. Still, it was the middle of the night. As long as their guards didn't make a habit of keeping their Byakugan active, he should be fine. Sticking to the shadows outside the complex, he approached one guard they had posted at the entrance. Extending his senses, he ever so faintly brushed them against the man's eyes, looking for the hint of chakra that would show they were active. Finding nothing of the sort, he was about to move on when he sensed something else. There was a small source of chalk forehead, not the eyes. Adjusting his focus, he scanned the area to find some sort of seal in place. Probing it carefully, so as not to alert the guard of what he was doing, he tried to figure out just what it was. It was a fairly complex piece of work, but Naruto had enough experience with seals that he could work out a general idea of its purpose. It looked as if the person who placed the seal could activate it to cause pain to the person wearing it. If he was right, they might even be able to kill the person. Was this some sort of punishment for something the man had done? Naruto had to wonder what sort of act would deserve a seal as nasty as that. Anyway, safe from the Byakugan for now, Naruto hopped the fence and began to explore inside the compound. He found a number of other Hyuga, mostly sleeping or preparing to join those who were. The startling part was that almost all of them had exactly the same seal as the man at the entrance. It seemed as if this was more than just a punishment. The seal must be some way to ensure the loyalty of the clan to its leadership. Nanami had said the clan was rotten and getting worse. He wondered if she'd had any idea how prophetic her words would be. More than once Naruto had been ashamed of the name he'd taken from his wife, but he never would have imagined them capable of something this disgusting. Naruto was half tempted to make a scene right then and there. He could find the people responsible for the seal and beat some sense into them. No, thinking it through, it's not like a few people could have forced the rest of the clan into this. At some point in the clan's history they must have agreed to have it put on them. As far as Naruto was concerned, the Hyuga had made their own bed and they could lie in it. Naruto would just treat them like any clan from here on out. No, even that was too kind. Naruto didn't want anything to do with them from here on out if he could avoid it. Deciding to take some time to clear his head, Naruto began to simply walk around the village. It was a nice quiet midnight walk until a couple of drunks stumbled out of a bar in front of him. The two were complaining quite loudly about a small border village named Habana that had just been wiped out. They blamed Kumo for it, but proclaimed loudly that the Yondaime would avenge them. Naruto said a quick prayer for the souls of those who were slain. It was sad to see civilians drawn into a war like that. Although the beginnings of an idea were forming in his mind. It might seem a little crass to take advantage of a tragedy, but it's not like this idea would harm them in any way. Leaving the village and heading into the woods, Naruto decided to get to work. He crafted a bunchen of a small child in raggedy old clothing. It looked like a 5-year-old version of himself and was dirty, disheveled, and thinner than a healthy child should be. Looking the clone over, it did make for a very sad sight, but it felt like something was missing. Naruto had heard the Yondaime could be a bit of a soft touch at times, but he wanted something that would really pull at his heartstrings. Quickly, Naruto realized what was missing and dispelled the clone. Naruto then replaced the half-starved young boy with a half-starved young girl that could have been the twin sister of his first attempt. Maybe it was just because he'd raised two himself, but Naruto felt a little girl would be harder to say no to than a little boy given an equally sad appearance. Examining his clone, he was convinced he'd made a wise decision. The clothes that were barely a step above rags, the long, blonde, tangled hair that was an absolute mess, the overly thin frame. Naruto felt a twinge of guilt just making something that looked to be in such a terrible state. Pleased with his results, he went to work on his own personal modification of the bunchen. Earth from the ground swelled up to be joined by water from a nearby stream and the air from around the clone. As they merged together, his creation went from being a mere illusion to very much solid. Naruto provided the fire and lightning himself by shifting his chakra to match the appropriate element. Having a working base, Naruto then set himself to refining it. He spent the better part of a week poking and prodding at it. Like an artisan, he relentlessly worked out all the imperfections that would set it apart from a real human. He worked the chakra coils until the chakra flowed through the body as smoothly as it would a natural one. Naruto was finally satisfied that there was nothing he could sense about the clone that felt it all off. It was probably significantly better than would be needed for this small bit of theater, but better to err on the side of caution. The only way the Yondaime would know something was off was if he probed deeply enough to detect the lack of a soul. Such an endeavor required deep meditation and was out of the reach of all but the greatest experts without your target being both trained to aid you and cooperative. Even if the Yondaime was one of those experts, Naruto couldn't see anything that would make him suspicious of this sad little girl being a soulless clone. Naruto finally finished the process by completing the part of the bunchen technique that would imbue it with his own memories and personality. With it now animated, Naruto supervised as it practiced looking as downtrodden as possible and refined a truly deadly set of puppy dog eyes. When he was convinced they were ready, Naruto set about getting the other actors ready. Creating 2 more clones, Naruto formed them into the seediest-looking men he could manage, one with a sword, and the other armed with a pair of knives. He would have liked to have spent more time on them, but as his ploy was less likely to work if he waited too long, Naruto only spent a few hours on them. They would seem normal enough, and would bleed when stabbed, but they'd only last a few days at most before the whole technique collapsed on itself. Not to mention that a close inspection would find any number of things wrong with them. Non-functioning organs and the like, as the bodies were kept animated simply from the chakra of the jutsu. Hopefully it would be enough. If all went according to plan, they wouldn't factor in long enough for anyone to give them a careful examination. Now, everything was finally in place, so it was time to set things in motion. Naruto grabbed the Anbu costume he'd stolen on his first attempt to break into the Hokage Tower and donned it again. Snooping around the outside of the tower, Naruto reached out his senses until he located the Yondaime. Good. There wouldn't be much point in going through with this if he was away today. Entering the tower, Naruto went straight back to the hallway he was caught in last time. If they had such security there, it was probably to protect something interesting. Just because he meant to get caught, didn't mean he couldn't look for valuables first. Not planning to make the same mistake twice, Naruto jumped up to the ceiling, using chakra to hold himself there. Now to see how prepared they were for people walking along upside down. Naruto continued on confidently until he felt a familiar flash of chakra. Apparently they were much more prepared for this avenue of approach than he'd suspected. That's what he got from trying to steal from a village of ninja. Naruto wasn't about to wait for the Hokage to show up this time, or even worry about going to the nearest window. Instead, he ran straight to the outer wall and burst through it. Landing, he took off running for the village wall as fast as he could. For a while, he'd almost worried he wasn't being chased, as he made it halfway there without being impeded. That proved to be the least of his worries as a kunai sped past him, allowing the Yondaime to teleport to it and block Naruto's path. Altering his course, Naruto dodged around him, trying to village wall. He was completely avoiding a fight, putting everything he had into speed as he worked to escape Konoha as quickly as possible. The blonde Hokage was not making this very easy. Escaping from someone faster than you is hard enough even if they aren't teleporting all over the place. Naruto could only credit adrenaline and pure determination for doing as well as he did. He couldn't afford to let any other pursuit catch them, as any delay might ruin everything. Once he'd gotten on the right side of the Yondaime again, he'd made sure to bat down every kunai that came his way with a sword, preventing the man from ever using it to get in front of him again. He also made a couple of half-hearted swipes at the ninja, just enough to keep him wary. Then whenever he got a moment's reprieve, he sprinted full speed, eating up as much ground as he could. Naruto made it over the wall somehow, immediately wishing he'd set the stage a little closer to the village. He knew there would have been too much risk of someone else spotting his clone if he did, but there was certainly a lot of risk with this approach too. Taking to the forest did help somewhat. The Yondaime slowed down whenever he lost sight of Naruto for a moment behind some cover, most likely wary of an ambush. This development was just the advantage Naruto needed to reach his goal. His chakra was burning brightly, allowing his clones to sense him coming, resulting in a girlish scream. Changing his course, as if in reaction to it, Naruto went straight for the sound, coming out of the forest as it opened to a small road. The scene he saw was just as he'd planned it. One man was holding a screaming girl up in the air by her arm while holding a knife in front of her menacingly. Meanwhile, another man stood nearby watching with a grin. When the girl saw Naruto, she started calling out for help, but Naruto continued past. The Yondaime, however, reacted the moment he popped out of the forest hot on Naruto's heels. The clone holding the knife quickly found his breathing stopped permanently by a kunai through its throat. Naruto ducked into the forest on the other side of the path and suppressed his presence as he watched. To his displeasure, rather than simply killing the second man, the young Hokage was holding him with a blade to his throat. If he was going to take him prisoner, he might notice there was something off about his captive. Not to mention that it would ruin the mood for the next phase of his plan. Thinking fast, Naruto leapt back out from hiding, swiftly but stealthily approaching the Yondaime from behind as if to catch him off guard. However, when he thrust his sword out at his back, his target teleported out of the way, just as he'd hoped, appearing next to the dead clone. His momentum carrying him forward, the sword instead went into the clone that had just been released when its captor vanished, killing it instantly. Naruto was already worried that not making good on his escape would seem suspicious, so he tried to keep some of that suspicion from spreading to the sole living clone. He did this by flinging the corpse of the still skewered clone at where the fake girl was cowering. At the speed it had been hurled, it would likely prove fatal if it hit. This also had the benefit of giving him time to escape again when the Yondaime jumped in front of the makeshift weapon and batted it away. Not sticking around this time, Naruto hid his chakra and plunged deeper into the forest. Now, on to Act 2, Naruto whispered to himself. Naruto watched as his real body escaped into the forest, the blonde Hokage deciding to stay rather than give pursuit. Thrilled by his decision, Naruto ran to the man, doing a pretty good job with the fake tears if he said so himself. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you," Naruto called out, latching onto his side and holding tightly. "I was so scared." "Don't worry about it," he replied, "but what are you doing out here by yourself? Where are your parents?" "They say Dad left before I was born," Naruto lied, "and Mom died a long time ago. I don't remember her very good." "Well, who takes care of you then?" the Yondaime asked. "The villagers gave me food," he answered, "but I didn't like it there so I ran away to find my big brother. I was going to the ninja village because they're supposed to be good at finding people. I even brought money." Naruto dug through a pocket and pulled out a few coins that wouldn't even have been enough to buy a decent meal. "Is this enough?" he asked, trying to work up some moisture in his eyes again for effect. "It's plenty," he assured Naruto, proving Minato was as kind-hearted as he'd heard. "What's your brother's name?" "Big brother is big brother," Naruto told him unhelpfully. "I don't remember him very good either, but you have to help me find him. I don't want to go back to the village. Well, do you know where he lives? He asked, to which Naruto just shrugged. You're not exactly giving me a lot to work with here, he sighed. Well, at least let me know what your name is. Naruto, he chirped out happily. What about your full name? He asked. People call me Minato, but my full name is Namikaze Minato. Naruto wrinkled his eyebrows and put on an overly serious expression as children often did to show they were supposed to be deep in thought. No, don't worry about it if you can't remember, he said after a few seconds of that. We can get that much at least from your village. Where are you from? Habana, Naruto claimed, seeing a startled expression on his face that proved he had heard that bit of news. Is something wrong? Naruto asked, deciding his reaction was strong enough even a child would have caught it. No, nothing to worry about, he quickly answered. I'm sure we'll find your brother. Right, Naruto said, letting a broad smile form on the face he'd so carefully crafted. I'm sure you can do anything. You were so cool when you were fighting the bad guys. How did you do that thing where you were over there, and then you were gone, and then you were back here? I'm afraid that's a secret, the Yondaime said with a chuckle. Please tell me, Naruto begged, giving the puppy dog eyes he'd worked so hard to perfect. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Naruto could see the effectiveness of the technique as his target looked to have almost been struck a blow. Come on, he urged the man on silently, it's not as if any kid would understand whatever complicated mechanics are involved. Or remember it well enough to repeat it back to someone. I'm sorry, he finally said, after recovering from the psychological assault. That jutsu is so secret I can't even tell the other ninja in my village. Naruto didn't hardly even have to act to give a horribly crushed expression. He would have to be a goody two-shoes about this, wouldn't he? If you're that interested, maybe there is something you can do, the Yondaime told Naruto, causing him to perk up immediately in interest. You look to be about old enough to join the next class at the academy. If you train hard, you could learn all sorts of jutsu. Whatever you decide, I can set you up with a nice place to stay while I look for your brother. Actually going through their training to become a ninja? That was an interesting notion that held some possibilities. Anyway, Naruto needed to play along for now if he was going to report back to the real him. So he soon found himself being picked up and carried back to Konoha, an assault to his pride he did his best to ignore. Naruto really should have planned out a meeting spot, as locating his clone proved more difficult than he'd anticipated. After searching Konoha for a couple of hours, he finally found his target hiding in the shadows of an alleyway. About time you got here, his clone called out, stepping into the light. Getting a better look at his creation now, it almost wasn't recognizable compared to when he last saw it. All the dirt and grime from before was gone and TNED and brushed. Then there was the most important change. The tattered clothes had been replaced with a rather cute pair of pink pajamas. Naruto couldn't help but snicker at that, a fact which earned him a glare. The workers at the orphanage just wouldn't stop fussing over me, his clone explained. I was afraid they'd never go to sleep so I could sneak out. So, what did we get from him? Naruto asked eagerly. Nothing, came the extremely disappointing reply, although he did give me an interesting idea for our next move. Oh? Naruto asked curiously. Have a clone go through their ninja training. They'll actively teach us what they know rather than trying to guard it. That is a good idea, Naruto agreed. You should get right on that. Not a chance, his clone shot back. We'll create another clone. A male clone to go through the training. Don't be silly, Naruto insisted, actually amused by this whole conversation. You don't think they'll find it suspicious if you disappear only to have another random kid wander into town a few weeks later? So we'll wait a couple of years, his clone countered stubbornly. That's no big deal for us. True, that would certainly help, Naruto conceded. Still, why wait? Especially when there's no guarantee our next attempt would go so smoothly. You're already in, and you've made a good impression on the Hokage too. That can only help. I hardly think getting saved by the village leader is really going to make much of a difference with the training. You know I'm right, Naruto said smugly. You're just being stubborn because you don't want to do it. Well, you know how humiliating this is and yet you're enjoying yourself immensely, the clone fired back bitterly. You know me so well, Naruto japed cheerfully. Fine, the clone finally agreed with a sigh. It's only for a decade or two anyway. It can't be as bad as cleaning up the Bijuu's chakra was, and we put up with that for over a century. I'm thrilled to hear that, Naruto beamed, because it would be a shame to deny Konoha such a cute little kunoichi. I said I'll do it, the clone said as threateningly as the body of a 5-year-old girl could manage, but if you keep cracking jokes like that, I won't be the only one of us missing an important piece of anatomy. Don't worry, Naruto said dismissively. I'll be gone for a while anyway. I need to get this body back in shape. I also want to play around with the few useful scrolls one found. Good, the clone said in genuine relief. Now get out of here. I need to get back before anyone notices I'm missing. Naruto obeyed, dashing off and making his way out of the village. He almost regretted that he wouldn't be staying around. Who knew that picking on yourself could be so much fun? One of the hardest parts of this scam was for her to remember that she was Naruto, not Naruto. She worked hard to even refer to herself that way in her own thoughts. Naruto was just thankful she'd picked a name so close to her real one. That made it much fairly easy to answer to her new name when called. Still, one slip when she was speaking and it could lead to some questions she preferred not be asked. The whole Naruto thing was a constant struggle for a while, but the worst part, hands down, was just living in the orphanage. She could deal with the fact that it was crowded with other kids. She could even play games with them, as she'd done that plenty of times as an adult. No, the part that really got to her was that the staff at the orphanage treated her like, well, a 5-year-old girl. Trying to keep a scowl off her face whenever the adults talked down to her was a sizable trial. It made the months until the new year at the academy pass very, very slowly. Finally, however, the day did come, and Naruto was looking forward to spending much of her time out of the orphanage. She was so excited that she found herself one of the first people to the building, waiting as the other students filed in. The highlight of that particular process was when a young Hyuga girl with dark blue hair walked in. Her features were similar enough to Hanabi's that she could have been her sister, but Naruto supposed that's what centuries of inbreeding did. Naruto had barely spared her the time to notice that much before looking away in disgust. She cursed her luck for getting stuck in a class with a Hyuga, but supposed it wasn't too unlikely considering there were a decent number of them living in the village. Naruto passed the remainder of the time waiting for class to start by looking at clan symbols of the students walking in. She then tried to figure out how many of them had their clan homes broken into by her. It turned out to be almost half the class if her math was right. Quite a few of the prominent clans were represented in the assembled children. Finally, the teacher called out for the kids to settle down. He introduced himself as Amino Iruka and began to drone on about what they'd be doing on their path to becoming a ninja. The lesson was designed for young children and Naruto soon grew bored, only half listening. That seemed to become the norm in the weeks to come. Some of the history lessons were mildly interesting, and their rules gave interesting insight into the ninja of Konoha. Everything else, on the other hand, was taught on such a basic level as to be virtually useless. As far as interactions with the other students went, Naruto tried to be friendly enough to keep her cover, but her heart wasn't in it. The other students seemed to pick up on this and soon left her be, making Naruto something of a loner. That suited her just fine, but it didn't change how monotonous things were. As far as grades went, she deliberately kept herself somewhat in the middle of the class. She could have easily made herself out to be a prodigy, but the less scrutiny she got, the better. Between the boredom of school and the frustration of the orphanage, Naruto prayed the years would pass by as quickly as possible. Sadly, that prayer didn't seem to be answered. Sasuke woke up to several voices talking loudly from outside his bedroom door. Pretending to still be asleep, he listened in on their conversation. Some of the voices sounded familiar, and he was pretty certain they belonged to other Uchiha, but he wasn't quite sure who they were. Face it, it's over. It was a fool's errand to start with, and now what small hope we had is gone. They'll be watching us even more closely after tonight. All the more reason to strike now, while we can still catch them by surprise. We won't catch them by surprise. This has Danzo's hand all over it. If it were Danzo's work, we'd have a lot more than one corpse. That would be because the Yondaime keeps him on a short leash. Sasuke was beginning to realize just how serious this argument was. Someone had died and they were discussing an attack of some sort. Even the Yondaime was involved. Just what was going on? Speaking of the Hokage, how are we supposed to deal with both the Yondaime and the Sandaime? Not to even mention all their allies. Even assuming we can still catch them unaware, it was a long shot before, with Fugaku dead and Itachi a traitor, we don't stand a chance. Sasuke reacted immediately to those words, jumping out of the futon and running to throw upon his bedroom door. Liar! He shouted angrily. Itachi would never betray us. Finally, having a look at who had been speaking, he confirmed they were men from the Uchiha clan. He also recalled that they had been meeting with his father a lot lately. They were joined by his mother, who was sitting nearby, eyes still wet with tears. He killed your father and ran off, the oldest member of the group exclaimed. If that doesn't make him a traitor, then what does? Quiet. His mother snapped sharply. I won't have you upsetting Sasuke any further. Get out and have your meeting somewhere else. Reluctantly, they did as she'd ordered, leaving the two of them aying. Right? Sasuke asked her hopefully. It can't be true. Tell me what really happened. His mother just looked at him sadly before wrapping him in a hug. But Sasuke found no comfort from that embrace. Naruto saw that Sasuke hadn't shown up today either, the poor kid. She'd thought her family had been dysfunctional, but even when things were at their worst, Nanami had never tried to kill her. It was a tough thing for any kid to go through, but at least his mother was there for him to help him through it. When Sasuke finally did return, he was more withdrawn. He became considerably less sociable, instead focusing more of his efforts on his studies. Sasuke easily pulled away from the rest of the class as far as grades were concerned. For her part, Naruto continued her charade of being an average student, finally making it through their first year. However, when Iruka was handing Naruto her final grades, he let her know that he wanted to speak to her after class. Not in a position to refuse, she agreed and shortly found herself alone with him in his office. I asked you here because of your grades, Iruka began sternly. Why? Naruto asked curiously. There are a lot of people with worse grades than mine. Why aren't you talking with them? I already have spoken to some of them, he answered, but in your case it's for a different reason. I've been teaching you for a year now and it's clear to me that you're a bright young girl. Whether it's taijutsu, math, or chakra theory, you can pick things up and understand them quickly. I've seen you do it any number of times. The fact that your grades are still only average tells me that you're not really trying. Iruka was sharper than she'd given him credit for to pick up on that. Naruto should have put more effort into making her act convincing. At least he only seemed to consider her unmotivated. She could play along with that belief for now. So I want you to tell me why you don't work harder, Iruka continued. I notice you don't really have any friends. Are you worried you might intimidate them if your grades were higher? It's not that, Naruto answered. I'm just not really sure I want to be ninja. Well, no one is going to make you if you don't want to, Iruka assured her. Still, you should at least consider trying until you make up your mind. You may find someday that you really enjoy it, and you don't want to regret being behind in your training then, do you? I still don't know, Naruto replied, doing her best to sound uncertain. At least promise me you'll think about it during the break, Iruka requested. Okay, Naruto agreed. I'll think about it. Good, he said, breaking into a smile. That's all I ask. Excusing herself, Naruto left academy. Rather than going straight back to the orphanage, she went on a walk to think over where to go from there. Should she let her grades go a bit higher to appease Iruka, and if so, how much? Naruto's walk led her to the scene of one of her classmates, a girl by the name of Sakura, being taunted by 3 other girls about having an oversized forehead of all things. They were apparently satisfied with their work, as the 3 of them quickly moved off, leaving the pink-haired girl in tears. Kids could really be cruel. Naruto's vantage point allowed her to see Ino, another of her classmates, approach Sakura and do a pretty good job of cheering the girl up. Good for her. It was nice to see that not all the kids in Konoha were such rotten brats. Still, said brats weren't likely to let up on their taunts anytime soon. Even if Sakura learned to deal with it, they'd just move on to other targets. Naruto wanted to see if she could put a stop to that as she slipped away in the direction the 3 bullies had left in. They hadn't gone far, and Naruto quickly spotted the 3 of them standing in a circle and laughing. One of the girls Naruto recognized from her class, but the other 2 were strangers. The largest of the 3 was probably a year older than Naruto was supposed to be. You really shouldn't go around bullying people, Naruto declared, getting their attention. I don't like your tone of voice, Blondie, the oldest girl responded. Naruto wasn't sure exactly what she'd been hoping to accomplish here. They'd hardly listened to any admonishment from her given how young she looked. Beyond that, it felt wrong to take a more direct approach against little kids. Still, it was best they learned. and Naruto was good enough to avoid hurting them. It wouldn't really be any worse than sparring. Well, too bad, Naruto told her, because I don't intend to change it. The largest girl approached menacingly, and when Naruto didn't back down, tried to shove her. Instead, Naruto grabbed the arm and flipped her onto her back. Boy, that brought back memories. It was more or less the same move Hanabi had used on her when they'd first met. Although Naruto had to say, she much preferred being on this side of it. The girl from her class actually tried to throw a punch at Naruto's face, but she easily batted it aside and rewarded her with a small punch to the stomach. Just enough to knock the wind out of her. She fell to her knees and actually started crying herself. Naruto turned to face the third girl, but she was already turning to run away. The one she flipped had picked herself up and was hurrying off in the other direction. You should go too, she said more kindly to the crying girl next to her, but tell your friends I'd better not catch them picking on anyone ever again. She did as she was told and sped off, leaving Naruto alone, or so she thought anyway. Those were some nice moves, Ino called out appreciatively from behind her. Naruto was surprised to see both Ino and Sakura watching from a short distance away. It was a real pain having to hide how skilled she was. Sensing someone coming required a certain amount of order to one's chakra. An order that went well beyond the amount of control she was supposed to have as Naruto. Since she didn't want anyone getting suspicious about how she'd got so good at manipulating chakra, she was forced to keep hers a disorganized mess. This meant living without her sixth sense for now. That didn't change the fact that it was embarrassing to have a couple of 7-year-old girls sneak up on you. Yeah, well, I just didn't like them much, Naruto answered. Don't be so modest, Ino insisted. You wanted to help out Sakura-chan too, didn't you? Thank you for doing that, Sakura added. You didn't have fight them for my sake. Don't worry about it, Naruto told them. It really isn't that big a deal. Nonsense, Ino argued. Why don't you both come over to my house? I'm sure my parents would be happy to meet my two new friends. Thank you for the offer, Naruto answered politely, but I'll have to pass. Turning to walk away, she was stopped when Ino followed after her and grabbed her arm. Don't be like that, Ino insisted. I've seen that you're always by yourself in class. You'll have a much better time if you make a few friends. Now come with us. I won't take no for an answer. Naruto was beginning to wonder just how many people were taking note of her every action in class. Ino was second person today to bring up how she didn't have friends. Naruto supposed it did look a little odd from the outside, so it might be wise to play along, if only to avoid another lecture from Iruka in the future. Really, how bad could it be? For once, Naruto's cautious optimism wasn't a portent of impending disaster. Ino and Sakura were both nice enough to be around. Sure, it wouldn't usually top his list of things to do, but hanging out with them was a nice break from the orphanage. Also, when they returned to the academy, Naruto found sitting by them and sneaking chatter when they could get away with it to be better than listening to Iruka drone on endlessly. On the topic of school, Naruto had decided to slowly raise her grades. Hopefully satisfy Iruka without drawing too much attention. As the weeks passed, however, Naruto was beginning to wonder if the friendship she'd formed would last. Ino seemed determined enough to make it work, but Naruto could tell Sakura wasn't entirely comfortable being around her. It was the same thing that made her a loner in the first place. She just really didn't fit in with kids their age and wasn't much fun to be around. So it was a bit of a surprise when Sakura approached Naruto at their usual meeting place in the park one Sunday morning and struck up a conversation. Ino wasn't there yet, and usually when she was the last to arrive the two of them would just sit in awkward silence until she did. Hey, Naruto, Sakura began cheerfully. I wanted to tell you, but there's someone I like now. Go on, Naruto said dryly. Don't hold me in suspense all day. It's Sasuke-kun, she supplied, not deterred by Naruto's lack of interest. Not you too, Naruto told her with a groan. Too? Sakura asked in confusion. Don't tell me you like Sasuke. The question sent Naruto into a fit of coughing. No, she finally said when she'd recovered. Ino likes him, not me. She was going on and on about him to me the other day. She really likes him? Sakura asked, looking depressed by the news. I'm afraid so, Naruto answered. Sakura fell into a bit of introspection at that, but it wasn't long before her expression firmed up. I guess that makes us rivals, she announced. I guess so, Naruto repeated, Still not very interested. I can hardly wait to hear the two of you comparing notes and making plans to win his heart. No, Sakura said simply, Ino and I are rivals now, we can't be friends anymore. That's stupid, Naruto told her honestly, getting a nasty look from Sakura. I knew I shouldn't have talked to you about this, Sakura snapped. No, you should have, Naruto fired back, because you need to hear how stupid it is. You're going to give up your friendship over some guy you have a crush on. It's not just about Sasuke, Sakura insisted. Ino is my best friend, but I need to prove that I can stand on my own without relying on her. Not that you'd understand. You're strong enough that you just beat up the people who were picking on me. I still don't see it, Naruto argued. If you want to toughen up, then toughen up. You don't need to throw away your friendship with Ino just to make a point. You said she was your best friend. Maybe it's just me, but I thought that meant something. It was my belief that a friend like that was something to treasure. Do you really think you'll be happier on your own again? Sakura was taken aback by her words, but seemed to be considering them. You're right, she finally said. I don't know what I was thinking. You obviously weren't, Naruto quipped, but Sakura didn't seem at all upset this time. You know, I was always a bit scared of you, Sakura admitted before breaking into a broad smile. But you really are a good person underneath, aren't you? Just don't go telling everyone, Naruto replied, smiling herself. After that day, Sakura became just as friendly to Naruto as Ino was. She even said that she'd started to find Naruto's gruff nature endearing. Well, the word she'd actually used was cute, but for the sake of their friendship, Naruto was doing her best to pretend she hadn't said that. The improved friendship wasn't always a good thing, however. Mostly she was referring to when Ino and Sakura double-teamed her and both insisted they were going to do something about her hair. Naruto had always just left it straight and didn't even take particularly good care of it. That wasn't good enough for the two girls, as they practically tied her down over her protests and started trying different styles. Eventually they settled on twin ponytails, insisting the style looked perfect on her. You know I'll just let it down again the minute you leave, right? Naruto asked them, appalled by the overly feminine style. Then we'll just put it back this way the next time we see you, Ino countered. I'll just cut my hair short, she threatened. It's a pain to deal with anyway. You won't get more than a trim if you know what's good for you, Ino told her. Unless you want me to make your life miserable, not only will you leave it like this, you're going to start taking better care of your hair. That means using the right shampoo and conditioner as well as brushing your hair properly every day. It's not worth fighting, Naruto, Sakura added. Ino is too stubborn to give up, and I've got her back on this one. Besides, it really does look good on you. Fine, Naruto relented. I'll keep the hairstyle and I'll even brush it, but I get to use my own shampoo and no conditioner. Ino only glared at her despite her concession. Alright already, just show me what you want me to use, Naruto told her. You don't cut me any slack, do you? I knew you'd see things my way, Ino said with smile. As far as academics went, Naruto's plan had kept Iruka off her back. That said, she found that rising through the class rankings drew a bit more attention than she'd wanted. Mostly because as she neared the higher ends of the class, students weren't too happy about being passed. Especially by some nobody who didn't even have a clan. Naruto was actually amused enough by the whole thing that she brought her grades up further than she'd originally planned. By early in their third year, Naruto had moved all the way up to the second spot. She was still well behind Sasuke, but the teachers were already praising him as a genius, and she didn't want that kind of attention. Naruto's plan was simply to sit back and coast at number 2 until graduation. That plan did hit a bit of a snag when Sasuke approached her shortly after she claimed the second spot. Sasuke had largely recovered from the murder of his father, although he remained much more driven since then. Still, he wasn't terribly social, and had never started up a conversation with her before. Congratulations on climbing so far up the class ranks, he told her. I hope you'll keep up the hard work. It would be nice if someone was at least a slight challenge in a spar. The words were polite enough, but somehow, the arrogance behind them rubbed Naruto the wrong way. I'll try, she said, gritting her teeth and trying to be polite in return. If I work hard, maybe I'll even give you a run for the top spot someday. Sasuke snorted in reply to that, showing just how likely he thought that would be. He didn't go so far as to actually question her claim, but the damage had already been done. Naruto forgot all thoughts of coasting at number 2, instead resuming her slow, methodical climb in grades. Before the end of the 3rd year, she'd caught up to Sasuke. And then she passed him. From that point on, Naruto played a bit of a game with Sasuke in where she would let him pass her and leapfrog back in front of him shortly thereafter. She supposed she was actually doing him a favor, considering he always pushed himself all the harder to regain the top spot. Still, she had to admit that she mostly did it just for the look on his face whenever he dropped to number 2 again. This little game was another way to distract from how boring the curriculum was. As far as ninjutsu went, they were only scheduled to learn 3 during their entire time at the academy and one he already knew when he'd started. Even worse were the special kunoichi classes on topics such as flower arrangement. Yes, she needed all the distraction she could get from those. Thankfully, Sasuke got really into the little rivalry Naruto had constructed. Every time they switched positions, she knew she would soon be getting a visit from Sasuke to either gloat or vow she wouldn't hold the top spot for long depending on which way it had gone. Considering that she was the only girl Sasuke would give the time of day to, despite most of them being interested in him, this of conversation with Ino and Sakura. "It's not fair," Sakura complained. "You don't even like Sasuke and somehow you can get him to talk to you." "I don't know if there's anything to be jealous of," Naruto told her. "Sasuke doesn't like me at all in either sense of the word. In fact, I'm fairly certain he hates my guts." "That's just the way boys are," Ino said dismissively. "He's just very competitive. That doesn't mean he dislikes you." Naruto bristled at being lectured by her about what boys were like, but let the matter slide. "I think Sasuke talks to Naruto because he respects her as a ninja," Sakura suggested. "I was thinking the same thing," Ino agreed. "If we worked a little harder, Sasuke might notice that and open up to us a bit more." "Not that taking your studies more seriously isn't a good thing," Naruto interjected, "but part of it might also be because I don't fawn all over him. You might give that a try too while you're at it." The twin glares he received made it clear just how they felt about that idea. "Yeah, how silly of me," Naruto said sarcastically. "It couldn't possibly be that." The girls made good on their plan to increase their training, often getting help from Naruto as well outside of class. Both of them were on the high end of the rankings even before this new push, so by early on in their 5th year they were beginning to pull ahead of the rest of the pack as they fought each other for 3rd. Sasuke and Naruto had a huge lead by then, and that wasn't likely to change, but Naruto was proud of the effort they were making. They even continued despite their hard work not having any noticeable effect toward getting Sasuke to notice them. Not that they'd given up hope that it might work if they just kept at it. Still, they might make decent kunoichi yet. It was about halfway through their 5th year, and Naruto was having trouble dealing with a guilty conscience. Glancing over her shoulder, she again caught Hinata looking at their little group. Although she looked away in embarrassment as soon as she realized she'd been caught staring. For over 4 years Naruto had been doing her best to ignore the girl, wanting nothing to do with the Hyuga clan. Nevertheless, over time it was getting harder and harder for her to do. Hinata just looked so miserable back there. As far as Naruto could tell, she was terminally shy and hadn't made any friends during their time at the academy. She'd just sit in the back of the class looking wistfully at groups of friends having a good time. She was just so unlike the arrogant, heartless Hyuga that Naruto so despised, that was becoming difficult to even think of her as one, despite her eyes. Finally, Naruto decided she could stand it no more. As soon as Iruka called a break for lunch, she was bounding up the stairs toward the back of the room where Hinata sat. "You know, you'll have better luck making friends if you talk to people instead of just staring at them," Naruto quipped. This probably wasn't the best approach to take as Hinata completely missed the intended humor, instead acting as if she'd just been reprimanded. "I'm sorry," she said weakly, "I didn't meant to stare." "What our socially inept friend is trying to say is, would you like to join us for lunch?" Ino interjected from where she and Sakura had followed Naruto up. "I wouldn't want bother you," Hinata answered, looking down at her feet instead of making eye contact. "It's no bother," Sakura assured her. "We'd be happy to have more company. No doubt you'll be more pleasant to be around than Naruto here." "I'm sure that's not true," Hinata said meekly. "Come on, show a little bit of backbone," Naruto urged her. "We're being friendly here and inviting you to eat with us. So are you going to accept, or are you going to turn us down because you'd rather eat by yourself?" There, that should trap her. Now it would seem more rude to decline than to accept. Still, he was surprised by how quickly she responded. "No, I'll go," Hinata said as strongly as Naruto had ever heard her speak. "That is, if you're sure you want me to." Naruto realized by how hopeful that last bit sounded that she must have been wishing for something like this to happen for a long time. All Naruto's excuses that part of her solitude might have simply been because she felt the other students were beneath her fled. This was a girl who genuinely wanted a friend. Her lack of confidence really was something else though. Even after they'd eaten together, it had taken them a few days to convince Hinata that she was always welcome to sit with them during class and join them for lunch. Once they'd done that, however, it was clear how much happier the young Hyuga was. It was like pulling teeth trying to get her to talk about herself, but over time, the three of them were finally able to get a picture of why she was the way she was. She was the only child of the head of the Hyuga clan, and a great disappointment to him, as he would frequently make clear. Nothing she did was good enough for Hyuga, much less the clan's heir. Naruto felt like a real heel for ignoring Hinata for so long. She could have really used a friend much earlier in life. There's no telling how deep the trauma went by now, or how much could have been prevented if she'd acted sooner. Hinata was another life added to the long list the Hyuga clan had worked to ruin, and Naruto had done nothing to stop it. She just wished she weren't undercover, as she'd love to have a word with Hinata's father. The end of her 5th year brought with it one change that Naruto had long been looking forward to. They were finally letting her move out of the orphanage and into her own place. Naruto thought 11 was a bit young for someone to be living on their own, but he could understand where they were coming from. She was only a year from becoming a full-fledged ninja, so they'd want her to learn to be self-reliant soon. Of course, there was also the fact that the orphanages were overcrowded and understaffed. Releasing one of the older kids who was actually asking to live on her own would let them devote more care to the younger ones. Despite finally living on her own again, her final year at the academy was in some ways her worst. This was largely because her body was developing as all girls did eventually, a truly mortifying experience for Naruto. This was only made worse by the fact that even some of the guys were become interested in the other sex. The problem was made clearest by one Inuzuka Kiba. He wasn't the first guy to approach Naruto asking about a date, but he was certainly the most memorable. It probably wasn't even entirely his idea, given the way the two other guys he'd been hanging out with were laughing and watching closely as he approached the group of 4 girls as lunch was ending. Still, whether it was a dare, or a legitimate attempt to get a date didn't really matter. Only what happened when he arrived. "Any of you 4 lovely young ladies looking for a date?" Kiba asked them without so much as a hello. "Not with you," Ino quickly answered. "Yeah," Sakura agreed. "The only person we'd go out with is Sasuke-kun." "Well, I knew you two were like that," Kiba admitted, undaunted by their quick refusal, "but I'm hoping your 2 friends might have better taste. What do you say, Hinata?" I don't think I'm ready for something like that," Hinata told him, blushing about as deeply as she'd ever seen a person blush. "The shy type, huh?" Kiba responded. "I'm okay with that. I may see if I can't convince you, but first I want to check if Naru-chan here is interested." Something about the whole situation just had Naruto at her limit. She was sick enough of guys asking her out, and Kiba was easily the worst of the lot. The way he was just casually switching from one girl to the next right in front of them as if he didn't even care who he went out with for starters. But the whole Naru-chan thing was what finally sent her over. She didn't want to deal with Kiba or any other would-be suitor. So she didn't even give it much thought and said the first thing she could come up with to get rid of him. "I don't like guys," she said loudly enough that everyone sitting anywhere close by could hear. She was treated to a host of shocked looks, with everyone nearby stopping what they were doing as they turned to face her. "What? You mean seriously?" Kiba asked, being the first to find his tongue. "Yes, seriously," Naruto told him firmly. "I don't actually know how to respond to that," Kiba announced wide-eyed. "So I'm just going to go back over there." Kiba made a hasty retreat, but the rest of classroom erupted into a multitude of conversations on the latest piece of gossip. Debates were already breaking out over whether she was telling the truth or not, but Iruka cut it off almost as soon as it had started. "Everyone quiet down," he yelled out angrily. "There will be no further discussion on this topic. We're starting class." "But we still have 5 minutes left of lunch," one student complained. "I said we're starting class," Iruka said through a clenched jaw as he stared down the offending student. No one else protested as he began their next lesson. "So, Do you think Naruto was telling the truth? Ino asked her two friends before class the day after her big claim. Naruto had run out the moment class ended without saying a word and now seemed to be waiting till the last minute to arrive today. Ino could understand why she wanted to avoid the rest of their classmates, but she still wanted to grill the girl herself. Well, I haven't ever seen her show an interest in any boys, even Sasuke, Sakura mused. And it is true that she's never been very into anything feminine. You're right about that, Ino agreed. Remember how hard we had to fight her to get her to do anything with her hair? And we still haven't made much progress on her wardrobe. Really, sometimes Ino was convinced Naruto would have rather been born a boy. It was kind of unfair that someone who cared so little for their appearance had so much natural looks. Not that Ino was any worse off on that front, she quickly reminded herself, even if she wasn't quite as early a bloomer as her friend. We are only 11, Hinata pointed out. Maybe she's just not interested in guys yet. She didn't say she liked girls. Well, she hasn't really shown any interest in girls either, Sakura admitted. Honestly, I think she may just be so devoted to being a ninja that she's suppressing her feelings. Kind of like Sasuke-kun. That did sound like Naruto. And Sakura was right, she hadn't shown any interest in girls despite being around Ino herself most every day. It was probably just something she said to get Kiba to leave her alone. You do realize I'm standing right here, don't you? Naruto asked, sounding annoyed at their conversation. Hinata was clearly ashamed to have been caught, and even Sakura looked a little guilty. Ino on the other hand was always happy for a chance to tease their slightly brutish friend. So, tell us the truth, what exactly are you interested in? Ino asked her shamelessly. Why don't you figure it out? Naruto told her. You seem to be enjoying doing that already. Even Hinata could tell by now that there was no real anger in that reply though. Just another one of the caustic remarks that made Naruto who she was. They all relaxed a bit to see that was the case. Whatever the truth of her claim, it didn't change the fact that they were friends. The furor around Naruto's pronouncement had finally died down when it was clear she wasn't going to say anything further on the subject. She was also happy to see that it really had proven effective in its original intent. For most of the remainder of the year, she didn't have a single request for a date. Kiba never completely stopped pestering her about if she'd been telling the truth, but she found that preferable to the alternative. Now, they were finally coming upon their first chance to pass the graduation exam and Naruto was trying to decide exactly how she wanted it to go. Should she let Sasuke win? Should she score something he could beat but only if he did really well and leave it up to him? Or should she score so high that he wouldn't have a hope of beating her? She really didn't have to think it over for long. First she'd figure out how good Sasuke would do if he'd really rolled out the stops training for this and then had everything go his way the entire exam. Then she'd do slightly better than that. No one had come beating down her door demanding to know how she could be so skilled yet, so getting Rookie of the Year shouldn't change that. Not to mention how great it would be to see his face when he realized that not only had he lost, but that he couldn't even blame it on a bad day. Knowing that she'd done better than he could have managed at his best, that would be sweet. While nearly everyone else was nervous, Naruto was already looking forward to the big day and was enjoying herself right up till when she was called in to do the final practical portion of the exam. Entering Iruka's office, she was asked to show off her Bunshin skill. Naruto should have just pointed to herself, broken her cover, and explained her modified version of the Bunshin just to see his reaction. It would have almost been worth it. Instead she simply went through the hand seals and summoned 23 copies of herself that all smiled and waved at Iruka independently. Very impressive, Iruka complimented her. I don't think this will come as any surprise to you, but you pass. Thank you, Iruka-sensei, she told him cheerfully. Before you go, I'd just like to say how glad I am you took my advice, Iruka told her. I knew you had the potential to be a great ninja if you put your mind to it, but even I'm surprised with just how well you did. I know how hard it can be to do so well without any family to give extra training outside the academy, but you overcame all of that. Iruka really was a nice guy. Done for the day, Naruto went straight home, returning early the next morning to see the posted results. Immediately going to the top of the list, Naruto was shocked to see it wasn't her name that sat there, but Sasuke's. She'd slightly underestimated him, as he'd beaten her by a hair with a combined rating of 378. 2 to Naruto's 378. 1. Forcing herself to look at the rest of the chart, she saw that Sakura had edged out Ino 261. 5 to 259. 7. Ino had a slight lead in every category save one, but it wasn't enough to overcome Sakura's domination on the written exam. Even Hinata had managed a 7th-place finish, not that it would be nearly good enough for her father. It was then that she noticed Sasuke hovering off to the side with a smirk. "It was a good try," he said in about as friendly a manner as he ever had. "I'll admit you made me work for Rookie of the Year." Naruto was seething all over again. The fact that he would choose to be a good sport about it now after all his taunts and boasting before infuriated her, and she was sure he'd planned it that way. If only she had chosen to make one more clone, or moved just a hair faster during the taijutsu portion, she could have put the arrogant Uchiha in his place. Now, Sakura interjected, joining into the conversation in an attempt to calm Naruto. "We're the top 3 in our class, we should all be happy for each other." Her words did little to cool Naruto's temper but did serve to tick off Ino, where she stood nearby muttering about the written exam counting for more than it should. "You were a distant third," Sasuke reminded her, before walking off and away from the group. The remaining month as the academy was a very dull affair. Lessons continued even for those who passed. Meanwhile, those who failed struggled to improve in time to pass on one of their remaining attempts before they'd have to repeat the year. In the end, all of them succeeded, and coast out to everyone. Now all the talk was about the big event that would set the course of their entire career as ninja. What team they would be assigned to. "Quite an impressive group of graduates," Sarutobi mused as Minato read of the results. "Have you decided what teams to put them on?" "Not yet," Minato admitted. "Iruka writes that Sasuke and Naruto have quite a rivalry going and suggests we put them on the same team so they'll continue to push each other. I admit it would be interesting to see where that team could go, but they're both so far above the other students, it's a bit unbalanced to stick them together." "Well, we generally put that top and bottom student together," Sarutobi reminded him. "That would help a little in that regard." "Except the person with the lowest grades is Nara Shikamaru," Minato informed him. "Do you want to be the one to explain to the fathers why we didn't put their children on the same team?" "I think we can ignore that tradition this year," Sarutobi declared, grimacing at the thought of doing just that. "Still, if I'd had a group of graduates like this when I was younger, I might have been tempted to take a second team." "What's stopping you?" Minato asked. "You don't have many responsibilities anymore, and based on the fact you're always in here bothering me, you obviously aren't ready to give up the ninja life and enjoy a peaceful retirement." "An interesting thought," Sarutobi replied, looking to be seriously considering it. "I was thinking of taking up a hobby to pass the time, but this sounds more entertaining than gardening or any of my other ideas." "I was only joking," Minato admitted, "but if you're actually interested, the offer certainly stands. Whatever team you lead would benefit greatly from it." "You know, you could always take another team yourself," Sarutobi suggested. "Me?" Minato asked in surprise. "Don't be ridiculous. Being Hokage keeps me far too busy for that." "I'd like to remind you that I was already Hokage when I trained my team," Sarutobi pointed out. "But I understand that it can be difficult to live up to the example set by the god of shinobi himself." "I'd love to make you eat those words, but I honestly don't know how you found the time for it," Minato admitted, irked a bit that he was bringing up that overblown nickname of his again. "It's not that hard," Sarutobi told him. "You don't need to directly supervise them all the time. I'm sure Kushina would be happy to help out when you're busy." "She probably would enjoy that," Minato agreed. "All right, I'll do it if you will. That way I can prove to you just who the better teacher is. I'll even let you have your pick, Naruto or Sasuke." "I'll take Sasuke," Sarutobi quickly answered. It would hardly be fair to deny the girl the opportunity of working with her savior now, would it? "Fine," Minato agreed. "Now that that's settled, let's work out the rest of the teams." Naruto could feel the nervousness rolling off her friends in waves as Iruka began announcing the teams. Not that she was that much calmer than they were. She was thrilled to finally get on a team and maybe start seriously learning ninjutsu and the like, but the wrong team members could make that a pretty miserable experience. Team 7. Haruno Sakura, Aburame Shino, and Uchiha Sasuke, Iruka announced. "Yes." Sakura cried out happily at being put with Sasuke. Team 8. Naruto, Hyuga Hinata, and Inuzuka Kiba, Iruka continued, ignoring the outburst. "Jackpot." Kiba cried out excitedly, eliciting a groan from Naruto. She saw Hinata wilt at her reaction and quickly ran damage control. No, Hinata. I'm thrilled to be on your team, she assured the girl. I just really didn't want to be with Kiba. I'm glad I'm on your team too, Naruko, Hinata replied, cheering up at her words. Team 10. Nara Shikamaru, Yamanaka Ino, and Akamichi Choji, Iruka went on, causing Ino to groan this time. I knew it was coming, Ino admitted. But that doesn't make it any easier. I don't suppose any of you would switch places with me? Don't worry, Ino, Sakura told her. We'll all stay friends even though we're on different teams. And I can tell you all about what it's like to work with Sasuke-kun every day. Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Ino said dryly. After the teams were announced, they were led off by their instructors one at a time. The big news in that was when the Sandaime himself came for Team 7. Naruko had to admit, she was jealous of that, and she wasn't the only one. It might have even been worth being on a team with Sasuke for that privilege. Anyway, Naruko's team leader was the last to arrive. It was already 15 minutes after the other teams had left with no sign of whoever it was. Some people get all the luck, Naruko complained. Can you imagine actually training under the professor himself? They say he knows all the techniques within Konoha. You're telling me, Kiba agreed. It's all because of Sasuke. He's getting special treatment because he's an Uchiha. I can assure you that didn't come into a play, a new voice added. And I may not know as many techniques as Sarutobi, but I don't think you'll be disappointed with my credentials. Naruko had recognized the voice immediately as the Yondaime's and was quite pleased with the thought of him as her teacher. She probably would have still preferred the Sandaime if it came right down to it, but he was a close second. You're going to be our teacher, Hokage-sama? Kiba asked excitedly. Now that's what I'm talking about. Please, the man replied. I remain your Hokage, but starting today, I'm your team leader even before that. So call me Minato-sensei. Now, if you'll meet me on the roof, I'd like to get started with some introductions. Minato was gone in the flash, and the three of them quickly hurried to the roof, seeing their sensei already there, along with a red-haired woman. I'd like to introduce you to my lovely wife, Kushina, Minato announced. Since work tends to keep me busy, she'll be helping me run the team when I'm otherwise tied up. I'm looking forward to working with you all, she said sweetly. Now, on to introductions. I want each of you to tell us a bit about yourselves, Minato ordered. Your likes, dislikes, dreams for the future. I like Akamaru and my clan, Kiba announced quickly, hardly wasting a moment after Minato's order. For things I dislike, that would have to be Sasuke. For my dreams, I want to prove to everyone how awesome I am and become Hokage someday. It's good to dream big, Minato said approvingly. How about you, Hinata? Well, I like my friends, Hinata began hesitantly. I don't like it when I disappoint people, and I hope to someday get strong enough to make my father proud. I'll do my best to train you until you reach that goal, Minato promised her. That leaves us with you, Naruko. Tell us a bit about yourself. I like training, Naruko said simply. For goals, I pretty much just want to learn as many jutsu as I can for now and keep working to be a top ninja. Oh, and I don't like guys that come on to a girl that obviously isn't interested. You mean you don't like any guys, Kiba amended. Naruko claims she's a lesbian, but I don't believe her. Kiba, Kushina exclaimed, sounding scandalized. That's not the sort of thing you just come out and say. She did. Why can't I? Kiba argued, rolling his eyes. Anyway, Kushina said, turning her attention back to Naruko. You may have grown up an orphan, but a good team should feel like family. So I'd be happy if you would think of me as the mother of this little family. At your age? Naruko said with a snort. She knew she shouldn't have the moment after she said it, but the thought of treating someone less than a tenth of her age as her mother was so ridiculous it just came out before she'd realized it. What's that about my age? Kushina said, her voice turning to ice. Naruko thought the truth would actually be the safest answer to that. It's just that you're much too young, Naruko told her. Kushina's anger fled immediately and she was all smiles again as she ran up and engulfed Naruko in a huge. Well, aren't you just the sweetest thing, she said in an overly saccharine tone. I've always wanted a daughter like you. Minato, can we keep her? You'll have to discuss that with Naruko, Minato answered weakly, clearly embarrassed by his wife's antics. Anyway, we still have an important test to take care of today, so I'd like to move on with that. Naruko used the distraction he provided to finally free herself from the Kushina's grasp. Although Naruto was curious about this test Minato was referring to, Kiba beat her to punch. A test? He asked. What kind of a test? I'll explain when we get to the test site, Minato answered. Follow me. All of them did, and they soon arrived at training ground. When they did, Minato pulled out a timer and set it on a log. Then he grabbed 2 bells out of a pouch and held them up. For this test, each of you will have 1 hour to get a bell from me, Minato announced. Those of you who fail to do so will be sent back to the academy. As there are only 2 bells, at least one of you will fail. What? Kiba protested. That's not fair. I liked this team and now you're just going to break it up. You should be worried more about whether you get a team at all than who's going to be on it, Minato advised him. I'm starting the test now. Naruto was actually quite pleased by this little turn of events. If she played her cards right, she could make sure Kiba was removed from the team. Almost any replacement would be better. Although she did wonder how they would fill in the last slot if they were doing this for every team. Unless more than half the teams had only a single person pass, it'd almost be required. It's okay, Kiba told them. 1 more year isn't a big deal. I'll let the 2 of you get a bell and just pass next year. No, I should be the one to fail, Hinata argued. I don't think I'm really ready to be a ninja anyway. Kiba had put up a brave front, but Naruto could tell how quickly he perked up at Hinata's reply. He'd probably been hoping she would say that. Naruto wasn't about to let it end like that, however. No, she declared firmly. Kiba, I'm not going to have you holding it over my head that I owe my passing to you. And Hinata, I'm not letting you give up so easily. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to play rock paper scissors. Rock paper scissors? Kiba queried, sounding unsure he'd heard her right. Yeah, the loser goes without a bell but still has to help the others, Naruto explained. Minato-sensei will certainly hold back if he wants us to have any chance of passing, but we are talking about the Hokage. We'll need to throw everything we have at him. If that's the way you want to do it, then fine, Kiba agreed, but don't come crying to me if you lose. You really should just let me fail, Naruto, Hinata argued. You did so well that it just wouldn't be right for you to fail. No, Hinata, we're doing it this way and that's final, Naruto insisted. And the winners don't owe the loser anything, since we all had a fair chance. Fine, Kiba acknowledged reluctantly. With the timer already running, they wasted no more time and started the game. As Naruto had hoped, both Hinata and Kiba telegraphed what they were going to throw. As such, Naruto was easily able to ensure each round was a draw until she got the outcome she wanted. On the 4th round, Kiba got stuck holding rock while Hinata and Naruto had paper, causing Kiba to let out a curse and Akamaru to whine pitiably. You're not thinking about going back on your word, are you, Kiba? Naruto taunted him. Of course not, Kiba said defensively. I agreed to help you if I lost and I'm going to help you. Now let's go show Minato-sensei what we can do. Naruto cracked her knuckles in anticipation, looking forward to a little exercise herself, but was brought up short when Minato walked over to the timer and stopped it. That won't be necessary, he said. It was a little rough around the edges, but all of you pass. What? Naruto asked in confusion. What about the bells? Yeah, Kiba agreed, somehow complaining despite the fact he'd been told he'd passed just after he'd resigned himself to failing. I was looking forward to showing off my moves. Don't worry, we'll have so much training over the years to come that you'll soon be sick of it, Minato told him. But the point of this test was to see if you could work as a team. Even putting that above your own individual goals. Although I must admit, I've never heard of anyone passing thanks to a game of rock paper scissors. I'm glad we were all able to pass, Hinata said happily. It would have been sad to have the team broken up so soon. Yes, well, good work today everyone, Minato announced. I have some work to get back to, but I suggest you all celebrate tonight. We'll meet together for our first mission tomorrow at 8 a.m. by the academy. Naruto was a little disappointed Kiba hadn't actually failed, but she supposed today still went well enough. Now, she could finally start picking the mind of the Yondaime and see what secrets it held. We should go out and celebrate all of us passing, Ino suggested, their usual group of 4 having met up after each had completed their final test. I found this great new restaurant with a really hot guy running it. A hot guy? Sakura asked curiously. Are you finally giving up on Sasuke? You wish, Ino said dismissively. Besides, this guy is too old for us anyway. and just because we're after Sasuke doesn't mean we can't appreciate a good-looking body. I'm sorry, Hinata told them, but my father said he wanted to see me as soon as I was finished today. I can't really go celebrate. Would you believe my father wanted to see me too? Naruto asked. Nice try, orphan girl, Ino responded, but you're not getting out of this one. It was worth a shot, Naruto quipped, but let herself be led along. A nice dinner didn't sound too bad. I'm home, Sasuke announced as he entered. Welcome back, his mother called out in reply. Now let me have a look at you. It's just a headband, Sasuke said. It's not like there was any doubt I would pass in the first place. Let your mother enjoy her moment, she admonished him gently. Anyway, I heard about your team. It's an honor to be training under the Sandaime, but it's a shame you couldn't be put on the same team as that Naruto girl you like so much. Mom, he complained. We're just rivals, nothing more than that. The way you were always talking about her, I would have thought otherwise, she teased him. I suggest you make sure that's all you feel about her though. A smart, good-looking girl like her isn't likely to stay unattached forever. You've obviously never had the pleasure of talking with her, Sasuke quipped. And I'm quite certain there's nothing between us. If you say so, she said. What about this Sakura who's on your team, though, isn't she quite taken with you? Obsessed would be a better word, Sasuke told her. The thought of being with her might even be more terrifying than with Naruto. It'd be a close match though. Anyway, I'm done talking about this, I'm going to go train. Don't be gone for too long, she called out to him as he was walking back outside. Dinner will be ready in less than an hour, and I'm making your favorites to celebrate. Sasuke was almost tempted not to go back for dinner, regardless of what she was making. Why did mothers feel the need to embarrass their offspring anyway? I'm glad to see you passed your final test, Hinata's father told her. You'd given me plenty of reasons to worry. I'm sorry, she said meekly, but I have been improving. My grades were much better this year. Yes, it's good they were no longer a complete embarrassment, but 7th place is nothing to be proud of, he told her. Especially when not everyone above you was even from Ohm times. I wish you'd be more like your cousin Neji. Hinata kept her gaze downward, but didn't like the implied slight against her friends. Sakura and Naruto had both beaten her and neither were from well-known clans. Naruto had a higher final score than Neji did, Hinata pointed out, still hardly believing she worked up the courage to talk back to her father. And she's not even related to any ninja. I wouldn't be so sure about that, her father replied. I've seen the girl, and I have my suspicions regarding her circumstances. Hinata was confused as to what he meant by that but didn't get a chance to ask before he continued on. Anyway, training under the Yondaime is a good opportunity for you, her father said. Maybe he can get through to you where I've failed. That said, I expect you to do better than you have in the past. I don't want you embarrassing the clan in front of the Hokage. I'll try, she promised. Don't try, do it, he ordered. Hinata was left with little choice but to say that she would, even though she had no idea what she could do to satisfy her father's demand. At least she had Naruto on her team to help her. Would you just shut up about the guy running the restaurant already? Naruto pleaded. I said I'd go, but you're making me want to change my mind. You know, if this whole not liking guys thing was just a ploy to get Kiba to leave you alone, you should probably drop it, Sakura suggested. As you're well aware, he doesn't believe you anymore. Although, if you are telling the truth, maybe you'd prefer to spend some time alone with me instead of going out to eat, Ino declared in a sultry tone as she leaned toward Naruto in a seductive pose. Naruto immediately jerked back in revulsion. The thought of a 12-year-old girl coming onto her making her more than a little uncomfortable. This caused both her friends to burst into laughter. No, definitely not into girls, Ino said when she'd regained control of herself. Anyway, we're here. Looking up, Naruto realized that it really must have been a new restaurant, as she was sure the building hadn't been there just a few weeks ago. It looked like a fairly nice one though, and she was a bit worried about her spending money. Sadly, it would have been a bit suspicious to leave herself with a large sum of cash. So what is this guy like anyway? Sakura asked. Well, I guess he looks kind of like a younger version of the Yondaime, Ino answered, causing Naruto's blood to run cold even as she stepped through the door. She suddenly got a bad feeling about this, one that proved prophetic when she finished entering and saw a familiar blonde turning to face her. What was he doing here? Hello, Naruto-chan, the man said. I don't know how well you remember me, But I'm your brother, Naruto. Yeah, Naruto was going to kill him. To be continued. Thanks for watching.